The 9,392nd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of international peace and security, famine and conflict-induced global food insecurity. The agenda is adopted. First, I wish to warmly welcome the distinguished ministers and other high-level representatives. Your presence here today underscores the importance of the subject matter that is under discussion. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Algeria, Argentina, Armenia, Australia, Azerbaijan, Bangladesh, Belarus, the plurinational state of Bolivia, Burkina Faso, Cambodia, Chile, Cuba, Denmark, Egypt, Estonia, Ethiopia, Georgia, Germany, Guatemala, Guyana, Haiti, India, Indonesia, Ireland, Israel, Italy, Jordan, Kenya, Latvia, Lebanon, Liberia, Liechtenstein, Mexico, Morocco, Myanmar, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, Nigeria, Oman, Pakistan, Panama, Philippines, Poland, Portugal, Qatar, the Republic of Korea, Romania, Saudi Arabia, Sierra Leone, Singapore, Slovakia, Slovenia, South Africa, Spain, Thailand, Tunisia, Turkey, Ukraine, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, Vietnam, and Yemen to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Rina Galani, United Nations Famine Prevention and Response Coordinator. Mr. David Miliband, President and Chief Executive Officer of the International Rescue Committee. And Ms. Naveen Salam, Founder and Chief Executive Officer of ADISIA. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite the following to participate in the meeting. His Excellency, Mr. Thibaut Kameli, Chargé d'Affaires of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, and His Excellency, Mr. Paul Beresford-Hill, Permanent Observer of the Sovereign Order of Malta to the United Nations. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the observer state of the Holy See to the United Nations to participate in this meeting in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2023/560, a letter dated 26 July 2023 from the Permanent Representative of the United States of America to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the Security Council, transmitting a concept paper on the item under consideration. The Council has before it the text of a statement by the President on behalf of the Council on the subject of today's meeting. I thank the Council members for their valuable contributions to this statement. In accordance with the understanding reached among the members of the Council, I shall take it that the members of the Security Council agree to the statement, which will be issued as a document of the Security Council under the symbol S/PRST/2023/4. I now give the floor to Ms. Rina Galani. Ms. Galani, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. President, Excellencies, and thank you for the opportunity to take part in this briefing today. Mr. President, this Council is more than aware of the multiple challenges and threats the world is facing today. But the threat of famine, people starving slowly to death, must be a red line. And yet the number of people suffering from acute food insecurity reached 250 million last year. This is the highest recorded in recent years. Of these people, some 376,000 were facing famine-like conditions in 7 countries. Another 35 million people were on the edge. As in all crisis situations, women and children are the most impacted. This situation has not come as a surprise. It is a man-made crisis that has been swelling for years. We are now at the tipping point. Mr. President, hunger and conflict feed off each other. Conflict and insecurity remain key drivers of hunger and famine. Every one of the 7 countries where people faced famine-like conditions last year were affected by armed conflict or extreme levels of violence. 5 of those 7 countries, Afghanistan, Haiti, Somalia, South Sudan, and Yemen, are regularly on this Council's agenda. Armed conflict destroys food systems, shatters livelihoods, and drives people from their homes, leaving many extremely vulnerable and hungry. Sometimes these impacts are byproducts of war, but all too often they are inflicted deliberately and unlawfully, with hunger utilised as a tactic of war. Conflict does not spare those who are providing assistance to stave off famine. Last year, dozens of humanitarian workers were killed, and many more were kidnapped or injured in situations of conflict. Humanitarian facilities and supplies also often come under attack, are looted, or used for military purposes. The difficulties the United Nations, NGOs and their partners are facing in Sudan is a stark reminder, and our deepest condolences to the families of the 11 humanitarian workers killed in Sudan in recent weeks. Food insecurity itself also fuels instability. For example, recent research highlighted by the World Food Programme has shown how food insecurity, when coupled with pre-existing grievances, desperation too often fueled by poverty and inequality, and governance issues cause people to choose violence over peace. It is the straw that breaks the camel's back, often resulting in conflict. Mr. President, Excellencies, conflict-induced hunger is compounded by a toxic mix of climate change and economic shocks. Climate change is increasingly becoming a threat multiplier. As the stress on water and other natural resources leads to increased competition and displacement, conflicts and hunger spread. Of the 10 countries most vulnerable to climate-related risks, 7 are affected by conflict, 6 host a UN peacekeeping or special political mission, and 4 have more than 1 million people one step away from famine. At the same time, insecurity in conflict-affected countries hinders climate adaptation efforts. This leaves already vulnerable communities even poorer, hungrier, and less resilient. Mr. President and Excellencies, the challenge may appear overwhelming, but progress has been and is again possible. So what can we do? First and foremost, we must redouble efforts to prevent, reduce, and end conflict in all its forms. There needs to be a renewed commitment to peace through a reinvigorated multilateral system where governments, the United Nations and regional organisations work hand in hand. Where peace may still take time, 5 things are critical to reduce suffering and prevent famine. 1. Ensuring parties to conflicts respect international humanitarian law. This includes protecting objects necessary for survival, such as food stocks, water systems, and other objects necessary for food production and distribution systems. It also includes facilitating unimpeded humanitarian access to all civilians in need and protecting humanitarian staff and assets. States must spare no effort in exerting their influence to ensure parties respect the rules of war. 2. Making better use of existing early warning mechanisms, such as Resolution 2417, in a focused and effective manner. Too often we have sounded the warning alarm without effective follow-up and concentrated action. 3. Being bold and creative in finding ways to mitigate the impact of war on the most vulnerable. Such solutions are possible. We have seen agreements between parties to the two conflicts and resolutions in this Council agreed to for this end, but they require political courage and compromise. 4, women and girls must be at the centre of our efforts. Crisis and hunger affect them disproportionately, and they also hold the key to lasting solutions. Research has shown that involving local women in peacebuilding increases the probability that violence will end by 24%. And 5, we also need to acknowledge that a halfway, fragmented response to interconnected risks will not cut it. We need adequate humanitarian funding, on which the lives of millions depend. And for lasting peace and famine prevention, we must address the climate and economic crisis. The Secretary-General has prioritised the threat of famine and hunger. Among other initiatives, in 2021, he created a high-level task force on famine prevention to lead and organise a cohesive system-wide response. Together with WFP, FAO, IRC, with David, we're in the process of reorientating this forum to provide dedicated support to countries. We really need your support, and we count on it to make this an effective forum. Mr. President, in this role, I have visited communities teetering on the brink of famine. I've sat with mothers in too many nutrition wards, in too many displacement camps. And as their small children fought for their lives, they were too weak to cry, even make a sound. That eerie silence is deafening. It never leaves you. That silence is also a call for action. As Martin Luther King said in his Nobel Peace Prize lecture, famine is wholly unnecessary in the modern world. There is no deficit in human resources. The deficit is human will. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. Galani for her briefing, and I give the floor now to Mr. David Miliband. David.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you to you and your team for your leadership on this issue. And Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a true honour to speak today on behalf of the 40,000 International Rescue Committee employees and volunteers working in 40 countries around the world. Our mission is defined by conflict and its consequences, so this debate means a lot to us and to our clients. Every day, our staff live out a simple mantra: focus on the solutions, not the suffering. So my briefing today takes the form of a plea to this Council to follow my colleagues and focus on the solutions, not the suffering. 5 years ago, the Council, and I quote, recognised the need to break the link of armed conflict and food insecurity in Resolution 2417. 5 years later, however, there is more armed conflict, more famine, more malnutrition, and more food insecurity. Food insecurity, the euphemism that is used for hunger and starvation. So today, our call is for action to help the 375,000 people facing famine-like conditions at the end of last year, a number that has only risen, and the 35 million on the brink. Mr. President, we have more than enough analysis. There is consensus that conflict is the primary driver of food insecurity today, exacerbated by the climate crisis. Consensus, too, on the line of causation from conflict to hunger. Planting is disrupted, prices are driven up, combatants block supplies, food storage is targeted, coping capacities are depleted. We also know the countries. Every single assessment has the same list: Somalia, Afghanistan, Yemen, Nigeria, South Sudan, Sudan, Burkina Faso, Mali, Haiti. The analysis is not in dispute, but analysis is too often followed by paralysis. So we need new muscle in the international system, not the muscle of debating strategies and plans, but the muscle of taking action. Today, I present to the Council 5 current problems matched by 5 immediate solutions. Problem 1. My colleagues on the panel will rightly draw attention to the impact of last year's funding increases on raising the number of children with acute malnutrition who are being treated. But the year-on-year statistics show that 80% of the world's acutely malnourished children are not getting any treatment at all. I repeat, 80% of acutely malnourished children have been getting no help. The reason is the divided approaches between moderate and severe acute malnutrition, different treatment and diagnosis protocols, different UN agencies, different products, complicated measuring systems ill-suited to conditions of conflict. The solution, however, is staring us in the face: a simplified system in the hands of parents and community health workers who use a simple upper arm circumference tape to diagnose acute malnutrition and administer 1 or 2 doses of ready-to-use therapeutic food per day, depending on whether the case is severe or moderate. Our own impact evaluation shows that this approach is not a pipe dream. We tested it on 27,000 children in Mali. We showed a 92% success rate with the treatment, with a cost saving of 30%, so more children can be reached for the same amount of money. Mr. President, This approach should be made the norm, the default form of provision in humanitarian settings, with delivery and funding to match, and it could be done now. Problem 2, there is proliferation of different global initiatives on famine and food insecurity. The solution is an empowered body to galvanize collective action and drive change. Fortunately, we do now have the high-level task force on preventing famine, chaired by Ms. Gilani, and given new focus and a new mandate. But frankly, RENA needs support. Support for national famine action plans in the countries most at risk. Support from national and local authorities in developing those plans. Support for engagement of regional and global financial institutions in funding and financing those plans. Support in diplomacy to unlock barriers on the ground to scale up a response, and support in turning delivery plans into action, starting at the September meetings in this city. Problem 3, the United Nations Development Programme reports that the more fragile a context, in other words, the more amount of conflict, the less money is spent on climate adaptation. Yet our clients represent a disproportionate amount of climate risk. They are highly vulnerable and lack investment in resilience. The solution is to give climate finance a humanitarian face, addressing the finance gap and the delivery gap. The finance gap arises because adaptation is underfunded. It's only 8% of all climate finance. And adaptation is geared towards richer countries. So we argue that a set percentage of every adaptation fund should be directed to fragile and conflict states. We also argue that donors need to increase the ratio of grants to concessional funding because fragile and conflict states don't want to take on new loans. For example, trebling the World Bank's international development assistance funds as the G20 panel recommended just 2 weeks ago. However, there is a delivery gap too. The money will not be spent in fragile and conflict states unless this delivery gap is addressed. In conflict situations, that means making it the norm, not the exception, for funding to be directed through civil society and not just through governments. This would be real localization. Problem 4, the rise of impunity in conflict. Combatants attack civilians, deny humanitarian aid, destroy farms and food warehouses, all illegal as well as immoral. The solution is that perpetrators need to be held to account. We do not need new resolutions for this, but we need resolution to uphold the existing ones. The next time this council is presented, for example, with evidence of hunger used as a weapon of war, it must trigger action. Also, all 9 countries at risk of famine this year rank either high, very high, or extreme in levels of humanitarian access constraints. That's another euphemism for stopping humanitarian aid workers reaching people in need. We propose an independent office for the protection of humanitarian access, which would ensure that when combatants deny aid, this information is reported without fear or favour to this council, supporting efforts to drive accountability and diplomacy. Problem 5. I know that NGOs usually start by asking for more money, but I will end with it instead of starting with it. The World Food Programme is cutting its life-saving food assistance programs today, sometimes by as much as half, because it does not have enough money to do its job. The solution to this, Mr. President, is not complicated. Humanitarian response plans in the 9 countries at risk of famine were on average only 58% funded in 2022. Yet if these countries' response plans were funded to the same proportion as Ukraine's last year, there would be another $5 billion in the system to address the most acute needs just in those 9 countries. We need to address the threat of famine by looking through the windshield, not through the rear-view mirror. Once a famine is declared, it's too late for too many. We know from the 2011 famine in Somalia that half the people who died before the famine declaration was made. It's too late for too many to wait for a famine declaration. Phase 3 of the IPC system, the International Phase Classification System, the crisis phase, is triggered when 1 in 5 families are so desperate to find their next meal that they are considering marrying off their children or sending them out to work. But anticipatory action depends on cash being available, and today it is not. I want to end, Mr. President, by quoting the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, whose landmark work on famine 50 years ago starts with these words. Quote, starvation is the characteristic of not having enough food to eat. It is not the characteristic of there not being enough food to eat. In other words, it's a political problem. 50 years later, however, the world is 4 times richer, but there is more famine, not less. That is not fate, it's choice. And it's a choice that will only be changed by action. We in civil society do not lack ideas for which actions to take. What we need is the will to enable them to happen. Thank you very much indeed.
I thank Mr. Miliband for his briefing. I give the floor now to Ms. Naveen Salam.
Thank you, Mr. President, and to your excellencies. The day I first met a 2-year-old that weighed the same as my newborn daughter, it changed me forever. I have been face to face with a mother and a starving child, and I know we don't have time to spare. I feel the urgency, and I see the fear in her eyes. I have seen children take their last breaths. I have watched their hearts stop beating. When I enter a malnutrition clinic, the first thing I hear is that deafening silence. The children don't have the strength to sit up or cry. All their energy is conserved to keep their organs from shutting down. Their mothers sit anxiously by, wishing for a miracle. We have that miracle. Today, I am representing the private sector as the founder and CEO of Edisia. We make the food that saves lives. This is a ready-to-use therapeutic food called plumpy nut. It is used in the treatment of severe acute malnutrition, and it's used by UNICEF, the World Food Program, and USAID. It is a highly fortified peanut butter that is revolutionary in humanitarian settings because it delivers life-saving nutrition, is easy to distribute in complex humanitarian crises, allows mothers to treat their children at home, and it has the power to rehabilitate 92% of children in just 2 months. Edisia is part of a community of factories around the world. We work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to produce enough of these miracle foods. But every day, the needs grow. All of us have been adding shifts, adding equipment, and yet more is needed. We manufacture here in the United States and have a partner in France, but our other 8 partners are in the global south. Conflicts threaten to close the doors of these incredibly important businesses that are set up in malnutrition hotspots to deliver these life-saving foods using locally grown raw materials. Just a few months ago, when the conflict in Sudan began, I was deeply saddened to see that our partner factory in Khartoum was bombed. Everything was destroyed, including thousands of boxes of plumpy nut who are waiting to be deployed to the children of Sudan. And now, this past week, a coup threatens our partner factory in Niger. In Haiti, violence persists at ever-increasing levels, forcing them to construct new security walls. In Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Burkina Faso, instability and uncertainty are ever present. This ecosystem is a critical part of the supply chain that the UN agencies depend on and children depend on, and they must be protected. The 2 biggest contributing factors to hunger and malnutrition are climate change and conflict. We here today have the easier problem to solve. Even with all the good efforts put into addressing climate change, it still will take many decades. The good news is this is not true for conflict. We control the conflicts. We, right here in this room. Just as we decide to wage war, we can decide to end war. Right now, we have 2 choices: feed all the severely malnourished children in the world or stop the conflicts. Annually, $1.7 billion is needed to feed 17 million severely malnourished children. Until we end these conflicts, We have the responsibility to take action. Just $1.7 billion to save the lives of 17 million children. A mere $100 per child covers the cost of a box of Plumpy Nut, distribution, and access to community health care. But with conflicts increasing, our partners have to make tough choices every day. They are struggling with critical funding shortfalls and are only able to reach 50% of the need. They are faced with the impossible decision of which half of the children can live and which half will be sentenced to death. Every day, they must decide which countries will receive funding and which programs will be cut or halved. 1 year ago, the world took notice of increasing conflict-induced food insecurity, and the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and the Kingdom of Netherlands, Ireland, and private philanthropies made a historic commitment of $500 million to combat malnutrition. The global momentum proved that we could double the supply of Plumpy Nut available in a matter of months. The number of children's lives saved was doubled as well, with 7.3 million children treated in 2022. The incredible effort should be recognized and celebrated. Doctors describe this intervention as nothing short of a miracle. But I want to stop producing this miracle. I don't want to grow this business, add shifts, or build more warehouses. We should not be waiting until a child is days away from death to treat them with life-saving food. Instead, the long-term goal needs to be a shift towards prevention. Early childhood development depends on healthy food systems, diverse diets, and essential macro and micronutrients required for the body and brain. Early interventions ensure that children will not only survive, but thrive and reach their full potential. I sit here today representing the thousands of community-based healthcare workers and millions of malnourished children who are desperately asking for our help and our partnership. After all, we are responsible for their circumstances. May history look at us sitting here today around this table as those who stood up for humanity, understood the power of our collective leadership here in this room, and said, stop. Just stop these conflicts for the sake of our children. There are not many problems in the world that we cannot solve. Malnutrition is not one of them.
I thank Ms. Holland for her briefing. Indeed, I thank all three of our briefers for their compelling and important contributions to our discussion this morning. Thank you. I would like to draw the attention of speakers to paragraph 22 of Note 507, which encourages all participants in council meetings to deliver their statements in 5 minutes or less, in line with the Security Council's commitment to making more effective use of open meetings. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the Secretary of State of the United States of America. Again, to our briefers, thank you. And thank you for keeping our focus on what's really at stake here, and that is the human element of our discussions. It's easy to get caught up in numbers and statistics and big concepts, but ultimately it comes down to people. It comes down to children. So I thank you for that focus, as well as on practical solutions to the problem before us. So to all three of our briefers, again, you have powerfully illustrated the challenge before us, but even more important, you've given us very good ideas for actually how to address that challenge. Last September, President Biden told the General Assembly, and I quote, "In every country in the world, if parents cannot feed their children, nothing else matters." In some ways, it's as simple and as stark as that. Too many families are experiencing the overwhelming urgency, the consequence of an unprecedented global food crisis that, as we've heard, has been fueled by climate, by COVID as well, and, as we're discussing today, by conflict. Hunger and conflict are inexorably linked. Scarce resources heighten tensions between communities and nations. Warring parties weaponize food to subjugate local populations. Indeed, conflict is the largest driver of food insecurity, with violence and unrest pushing 117 million people into extreme deprivation last year. In Sudan, the fighting has disrupted the summer planting season and driven up the cost of food. In Myanmar, where 1 in 5 people is severely undernourished, the military regime is making the problem worse to tighten its grip, including blocking aid convoys. Deteriorating conditions prevent the safe return of nearly 1 million Rohingya refugees who fled their homeland and who now live in Bangladesh on rations that are down to about 27 cents per day. In Yemen, some families have reported and resorted to boiling leaves to stay alive. They call it famine food. Unless the world acts, Burkina Faso, South Sudan, Somalia could all experience famine next year. And again, I ask each of us, pause for that for a moment. Think about what that actually means. Imagine just for a minute if this was your child, your son, your daughter. You heard the compelling description of what that actually is all about. And I hope, if nothing else, having that image in our minds, tying it to our own lives and experiences, will be some added motivation for us to act. Since January 2021, the United States has provided more than $17.5 billion to address famine and food insecurity. In 2021 and 2022, we convened this council to focus on the intersection between hunger and conflict. We chaired last year's Food Security Ministerial, where we joined over 36 countries in issuing a global roadmap, committing to get food to those in need and to build greater resilience for the future. To date, more than 100 countries have signed that pledge and begun to take concrete steps to actually implement it. But as this crisis ramps up, so must our efforts. This council is charged with maintaining international peace and security. And we simply cannot preserve peace and security without strengthening food security. Each of us has a responsibility to act. This morning, for the first time in 3 years, this council has unanimously put conflict, hunger and famine, as well as climate change, at the center of its agenda. This is a noteworthy and welcome step. Now, let's harness the momentum to further combat food insecurity and famine around the world, to turn what we're talking about into concrete actions. 5 years ago, as you've heard, this council adopted Resolution 2417, emphasizing that the intentional starvation of civilians may constitute a war crime. Today, we can build on these efforts. Nearly 90 countries, including the United States, have already signed a new joint communique that we drafted and circulated, committing to end the use of famine, starvation, and food as weapons of war. Hunger must not be weaponized. I urge all member states to join this communique. We also must significantly increase aid to tackle extreme hunger and to avert famine. Last year, governments and private donors made record contributions, providing direct relief, equipping farmers with fertilizer, using satellite imagery to maximize yields. Donations for the World Food Program jumped 48%. The United States alone provided more than $7.2 billion, funding roughly half of the World Food Program's budget. These and other efforts helped the world narrowly avoid famine last year. But this year, as we've heard, the World Food Program estimates that it has to spend $25 billion to deliver relief to 171 million people. To date, countries have funded only $4.5 billion. In other words, 18% of what's required. The cost of that shortfall will be measured in growth stunted and in lives lost. While we welcome smaller countries punching above their weight, the world's largest economies should be the world's largest donors. For member states that consider themselves global leaders, this is your chance to prove it. All of us can dig deeper. But, of course, we know, while it is necessary, it is not sufficient to meet immediate needs. We must also increase agricultural productivity. We've got to invest in adaptation. We have to build greater resilience to future shocks, especially in regions that are affected by conflict. Around the world, farmers confront soaring temperatures, eroding soil, disappearing groundwater. That reduces yields. It makes crops less nutritious. By 2050, climate change could cut output by as much as 30%, even as global food demand increases by over 50%. So we have a planet that's heading in the coming decades to a population of as much as 10 billion people, with demand going up in accordance, and yet supply is actually declining, not increasing. So as challenging, as urgent as the situation is now, we can also see what's coming if we don't take the necessary steps to address it. Mitigating climate impacts is central to the United States Feed the Future initiative, a public-private partnership to strengthen food systems, to expand social safety nets, to enhance nutrition in 40 countries around the world. We've devoted over $1 billion every year to this effort. Last year, we expanded the program to 8 more target countries in Africa. To build on this work, we've now launched what we call Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils in February, alongside the African Union and the Food and Agriculture Organization. The shorthand, VAX, through this program, we're identifying the most nutritious indigenous African crops, assessing how climate change will likely affect them, and investing in breeding the most climate resilient and most resilient varieties, as well as improving the soil that they'll grow in. This focus on the quality of the seeds and the quality of the soil can have a powerful impact on sustainable agricultural productivity throughout Africa. Today, I'm also announcing $362 million more to tackle the drivers of food insecurity and to enhance resilience in Haiti and 11 African countries, like getting nutritious food to pregnant women and helping farmers grow hardier and more diverse crops. The United States will continue to do our part, but this is, by definition, a global challenge. It demands global resources. And we'll be looking to governments, to companies, to philanthropies to help us continue to improve nutrition and invest in sustainable and resilient food systems. Finally, we must address Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and the resulting assault on the global food system. This past year, the Black Sea Grain Initiative, negotiated by the United Nations and Turkey, delivered over 32 million tons of Ukrainian foodstuffs to the world. Wheat exports alone were the equivalent of 18 billion loaves of bread. 18 billion loaves of bread. Keep in mind, this initiative never should have been necessary in the first place. It only was necessary because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its blockade of Ukrainian ports. But the initiative produced concrete, demonstrable, powerful results in making sure that these food products could continue to get to world markets, going to those who needed it. And let's be very clear about who benefited from this initiative. Over half the food products exported through this effort and 2/3 of the wheat went to developing countries. These shipments helped to lower global food prices for everyone by roughly a quarter since Russia's full-scale invasion. Since Russia pulled out of the arrangement on July 17th, ignoring the world's appeals, grain prices have risen by more than 8% around the world. Kenya's foreign ministry called Russia's move, and I quote, a stab in the back. The Kremlin claims that it tore up the deal because international sanctions were restricting its agricultural exports. In reality, sanctions explicitly exclude food and fertilizer. In fact, at the time it abandoned the initiative, Russia was exporting more grain at higher prices than ever before. And what has Russia's response been to the world's distress and outrage? Bombing Ukrainian granaries, mining port entrances, threatening to attack any vessel in the Black Sea, no matter its flag, no matter its cargo. These actions are consistent with Russia's decision last month to block the reauthorization of critical cross-border humanitarian assistance to Syria, the country where, after February's devastating earthquake, 12 million people don't have enough to eat. The United States is prepared to renew efforts to mandate this vital lifeline if the United Nations and Syria cannot find a way forward. We also very much appreciate Turkey and others working to reinstate the grain deal. Every member of this council, every member of the United Nations should tell Moscow, enough. Enough using the Black Sea as blackmail. Enough treating the world's most vulnerable people as leverage. Enough of this unjustified, unconscionable war. Strengthening food security is essential to realizing the vision of the United Nations Charter, to save generations from the scourge of war and reaffirm the dignity and worth of every single human being. That hope is embodied in one of the statues outside this building of a figure fulfilling the biblical directive to beat swords into plowshares. These words of Scripture are not yet in reach, but we can at least commit not to use our swords to destroy others' plows. We can deliver life-saving aid to those in urgent need. We can ensure that people around the globe are fed now and for years to come. If we do that, if we build a healthier, more stable, more peaceful world for all, we will have at least begun to live up to the responsibility entrusted to us, entrusted to this council, entrusted to this institution. Thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Dora bint Mohammed Al-Kibi, Minister of State of the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you, Secretary Blinken, for convening this important meeting today, and to our briefers for bringing their valuable perspectives to our discussion. We align ourselves with the statement made by Oman on behalf of the Gulf Cooperation Council. More than 700 million people are going hungry around the world, while a third of the world's population, almost 2.5 billion people, had restricted access to food last year. As we have heard from our briefers, there is no single reason for global food insecurity. Though the reasons for it are complex, the human cost is plain to see. 45 million children under the age of 5 suffer from acute malnutrition. Millions of people are driven to undertake dangerous, irregular migration journeys. There is increased sexual and gender-based violence. We know that food insecurity contributes to conflict and instability, while the reverse is also true. As intricately linked as they are, within the Council and globally, we cannot afford not to act. Today, there are 3 points I wish to make to this effect. First, food insecurity is preventable. Preventing food insecurity and famine is a political choice. Bringing food insecurity to an end is a collective endeavor. No one should experience famine. In conflict, international humanitarian law is clear. Parties to armed conflict must take constant care to spare the objects necessary to produce food and drinking water, and they must never target civilian objects. There is not only a moral but a legal duty to uphold these norms, and we call upon all parties to conflict to strictly adhere to their responsibilities. It is also important that those in a position to support and facilitate life-saving humanitarian efforts do so. For its part, the UAE has contributed more than $1.4 billion in assistance in over the past 5 years to address food insecurity. Conflicts such as in Ukraine can contribute to global food insecurity. Its knock-on effects in world markets mean that those living far beyond any battlefield often struggle to feed their families, especially in the Middle East and parts of Africa, where countries rely heavily on grain imports. In these instances, we must support national strategies and develop innovative approaches and partnerships that meet the scale of the challenge. Second, ensuring global food security requires all hands on deck. We must deepen international partnerships and make the most of multilateral fora at both the international and regional levels. We saw the potential of multilateral efforts to reduce food insecurity through the establishment of Black Sea Grain Initiative. The rise in wheat prices since the agreement came to an end, and let me reiterate that the UAE is deeply saddened by this development and is telling of a global importance of such initiative. A spirit of ambition and global collaboration is also needed to tackle a growing driver of food insecurity, climate change. July was the hottest month on record. As such, we must see unity of purpose at the highest levels to reverse this disturbing trend by taking tangible measures to prevent the rise of temperatures above 1.5 degrees and ensuring climate adaptation and mitigation measures are firmly in place, particularly in fragile areas. All hands on deck truly means all hands and all voices. Those disproportionately affected by food insecurity and climate change, in particular women and youth, must be front and center when designing responses. Recognizing the disparity is not enough. We must encourage their full, equal, and meaningful participation. Third, and we need novel approaches to this challenge. We commend the dedicated efforts of governments, international, regional organizations, private sectors, actors, and humanitarian groups, and their significant achievements in this field. Yet, food insecurity continues to rise. If we limit ourselves to the same approaches, we will not turn this tide. So it's time to expand our approaches. Public-private partnerships are vital to tackling this huge challenge. The UAE is actively engaged in public-private partnerships, such as the Mohammed bin Rashid Global Initiative's annual 1 billion meal campaign. And in 2021, the UAE and the United States launched the Agriculture Innovation Mission for Climate to catalyze innovation in climate-smart agriculture. It now works with over 50 government partners, the private sector and civil society, and has raised more than $13 billion to accelerate transformational change. Mr. President, the world cannot maintain peace and security without one of the most basic needs for humanity. The trend we are witnessing is a testament to the need to redouble our efforts. It is my hope that we seize the opportunity of this meeting to take greater concerted action globally to overcome this challenge. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Al-Kaibi for her statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Kenji Yamada, State Minister for Foreign Affairs of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, Japan welcomes the issuance of the PRST and commends all the tireless work of you and your U.S. team, as well as the constructive effort made by each fellow member state. It is critical that the Council speak in one voice on its commitment to address conflict-induced food insecurity. Mr. President and colleagues, Japan is seriously concerned that a huge number of people are facing famine and other food insecurity caused by conflict and climate change. Food is a basic human need. Thus, it should not be weaponized at any time. Every day, we hear voices of food insecurity caused by man-made conflict. Japan deeply regrets Russia's decision to unilaterally terminate its participation in Black Sea Grain Initiative, which had allowed grain exports from Ukraine and contributed to global food security. Russia has wasted tremendous amounts of grain by attacking grain storage and loading terminals in Odessa and along the Danube. Meanwhile, Russia announced that it will replace Ukraine in supplying grains to African countries. We should not accept Russia's attempt to weaponize food to destroy grains in Ukraine while increasing its own exports. Japan strongly urges Russia to return to the international framework associated with the UN to resume grain exports from Ukraine in order to relieve food insecurity in the world. Japan also continued to support EU-led solidarity lanes, which works to ensure Ukraine can export grains. Mr. President and colleagues, the UN and this Council should play their roles in combating food security issues while exerting the influence and solidarity. Addressing famine and conflict-induced food insecurity requires not only short-term efforts such as the emergency food assistance, but also medium and long-term actions based on the concept of human security, such as strengthening the resilience of food systems. Efforts to prevent conflicts, which are root cause of food insecurity, is also important. In this context, Japan believes that it would be beneficial to reduce future humanitarian needs by addressing a comprehensive way through humanitarian development peace nexus approach. In conflict, it is crucial to protect vulnerable people such as women and children. In order to realize the provision of life-saving assistance for those vulnerable people, parties to conflict must comply with international humanitarian law. Mr. President and colleagues, food security and humanitarian assistance have been top priority for Japan. We have a long history of providing various assistance and international cooperation, including humanitarian aid necessary for those suffering from famine and conflict-induced food insecurity. Japan has also spoken out about the necessity of humanitarian passage on Black Sea to ship grains from Ukraine just after Russia's aggression. Japan is proud to have issued the Hiroshima Statement for Resilient Global Food Security in May, together with countries representing various regions around the world. It can be a comprehensive guideline for responding to the immediate food security crisis and for establishing resilient agriculture and food system in the medium and long term. Before closing, allow me to touch upon the issue of famine and food insecurity in East Asia and beyond. In North Korea, it is reported that many people are suffering from severe hunger. On the other hand, North Korea is spending vast resources on unlawful nuclear and missile development by diverting critical needed resources away from its people at tremendous cost. Violating multiple UN Security Council resolutions, North Korea has been repeatedly launching ballistic missiles and threatening peace and stability in East Asia, even now. Mr. President and colleagues, it is extremely regrettable that the Security Council has not been able to take tangible actions on this matter. The Council must overcome its prolonged silence and take meaningful steps with a united voice. We sincerely ask for you, everyone, understanding and support. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Yamada for his statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Meggie Fino, Deputy Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking the United States Presidency for convening this timely debate and welcome you, Secretary Blinken, in the chair. We're grateful to the United States for its coherence and continued action in keeping the focus on this issue of paramount importance for all of us, especially for those anywhere who continue to struggle to make ends meet. In this respect, we welcome the PRST proposed by the U.S. and adopted this morning as a timely reminder of the collective duty to put everything in place to ensure proper responses to address conflict-induced food insecurity, including malnutrition and famine. I also thank all three briefers for their insightful presentations and for presenting before us the most realistic needs required worldwide today. Food insecurity is a pressing global challenge, and today, more than ever, a range of colliding factors such as conflicts, climate change, underdevelopment, and macroeconomic shocks are threatening global food security worldwide. The number of people facing acute food insecurity has increased from 193 million in 2021 to 258 million in 2022. More than 250 million people faced acute hunger in 58 countries and territories last year. In 19 countries and territories, roughly 117 million people suffer from high levels of acute food insecurity due to conflict and insecurity. This has put a heavy toll on humanitarian interventions and food assistance efforts to meet the growing needs. Further, acute hunger, one step away from famine, is increasingly alarming and constitutes a threat not only to the communities and the populations concerned, but also to peace and security in many regions of the world. This is what is happening nowadays in Afghanistan, Haiti, the Sahel region, South Sudan, Yemen, where populations face starvation in absence of urgent humanitarian intervention. This is what is happening in Syria. The Russian veto on the cross-border authorization of Bab al-Hawa, Syria, has endangered the life-saving aid and food security for over 4 million people in northwest Syria, leaving them to the mercy of a ruthless regime notoriously known for its brutality. The Russian withdrawal from the Black Sea Grain Initiative confirms a policy of weaponization of food and the use of famine as a bargaining chip to achieve political gains. But Russia did not stop there. With its daily bombardments of seaports targeting grain export facilities, a civilian infrastructure, Russia is committing crimes and is playing with the anxiety of millions, unsure to have food in the coming days and weeks. Moscow's promises to several African countries for modest amounts of free grain supplies, ridiculous compared to the actual needs, are part of its efforts to capitalize on the collapse of the BSGI and gain support in the African continent. But beware, this kind of humanitarian charity will come with a bitter price tag. Without urgent action, more and more people in Africa, the Middle East, and beyond will slip into hunger. Mr. President, the biggest challenge in every conflict is protecting civilians. It is at the same time a collective, solemn commitment. Resolution 2417 represents a breakthrough moment since, for the first time, the Security Council acknowledged the link between armed conflict and conflict-induced food insecurity and the threat of famine. Using starvation as weapon, as a tactic of warfare, is wrong and criminal. It is prohibited by international humanitarian law, and we must never tolerate any unlawful denial of humanitarian access and depriving civilians of what is indispensable to their survival. We must never tolerate impunity for violations of international humanitarian law, targeting civilian infrastructure and food-related services. Albania commends the efforts and actions of member states, the UN, its implementing partners, civil society, and the private sector in addressing immediate humanitarian needs, food security, and resilience for populations in need. But the best and the most effective way of preventing famine is to prevent conflict, to stop wars, to tackle the root causes of insecurity at early stages, and invest in peace and development in order to secure sustainable, resilient, and inclusive food systems in line with the objectives of the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals. Let me conclude, Mr. President, by saying that the world has enough food and no one needs to go hungry. Yet, If we really want to ensure food security, we should act to prevent and stop conflicts by choosing peace and development, by engaging into inclusive peace processes, leading to sustainable political solutions, by building resilience, by working together in favor of life with rights and dignity. This is done by saying no, strongly and resolutely, to wars and conflicts and their devastating consequences. This requires vision, leadership, political will, and decisive action. I thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Fino for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur
Mr. President, Secretary of State, I would like, first of all, to congratulate the UK on its presidency of the Council in July, and I wish you, Mr. President, and your team every success in this month's work. You can count on Switzerland's support. I would also like to thank you for organising this timely debate and the speakers for their contributions. We also welcome the presence of high-level representatives. War breeds hunger, and hunger breeds war. The global food crisis is without precedent and is destabilizing countries and regions, as was also demonstrated by the debate on the protection of civilians last May under the Swiss presidency. The phenomenon continues to worsen in Somalia, Sudan, especially in Darfur, South Sudan, the Sahel, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, and elsewhere in the world. We therefore regret Russia's decision to cease the implementation of the Black Sea Initiative and condemn the recent attacks on Ukrainian ports, which risks to further deteriorating the global situation. In adopting Resolution 2417, the Council recognised the need to put an end to the vicious circle of armed conflict and food insecurity. It pledged to pay full attention to this issue in order to better prevent famine. The Council's role in crisis prevention is also at the heart of the new agenda for peace. Switzerland calls for the full implementation of the prevention mechanisms provided for in Resolution 2417 and welcomes the recent meeting on food security in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Burkina Faso, and Haiti. In order to better prevent food crises, including famine, my country calls for the following three areas to be strengthened. First, respect for international humanitarian law and human rights by all parties is imperative to minimize the impact of armed conflict on the food situation. Access by civilians to essential goods and services must be preserved. Items that are essential to civilian survival, such as foodstuffs, water installations, and other infrastructure needed for food production and supply, must not be attacked and must be protected as required by international humanitarian law. We call on the parties concerned to guarantee the rapid, safe, and unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid to those in need. We deplore the fact that humanitarian actors such as the ICRC are not always able to carry out their operations, as is currently the case across the Lachin corridor in the South Caucasus. We also recall the importance of implementing Council Resolution 2664, which facilitates humanitarian operations in some of the most difficult contexts. Second, in many fragile contexts, it is often women and girls who eat last and eat least. This is even truer in situations of conflict, where women and girls also seek solutions, as pointed out by the Special Representative of the Secretary-General on sexual violence in conflict. We must not underestimate the fact that food insecurity increases the risk of exposure to sexual violence. This is why we need to ensure that a gender perspective is integrated into measures to improve food security. Third, impunity, particularly for those who deliberately starve civilians as a method of warfare, must be resolutely combated. All too often, the civilian population is deliberately deprived of its means of subsistence, causing immense suffering and further destabilizing conflict zones. In 2019, the Statute of the International Criminal Court was amended on Switzerland's initiative so that this crime can also be prosecuted in situations of internal conflict. We call on all states parties to ratify this amendment. President, you cannot build peace on empty stomachs, as the American agronomist and Nobel Prize winner Norman Borlaug reminds us. This makes it all the more important to tackle the root causes of food insecurity. Armed conflict and violence are the main drivers. And the growing pressure exerted by economic crises and climate change add to the difficulties. Political solutions to conflict must be part of our global approach to eliminating hunger, ensuring access to sufficient and adequate food for all, and promoting resilient, inclusive and sustainable food systems. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de la Suisse.
I
To the representative.
thank the representative of Switzerland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the briefers for their compelling presentations. As focal points for this issue at the Council, together with Switzerland, we thank the United States for providing this opportunity to advance our fight against conflict-induced food insecurity and malnutrition. We also congratulate the United States on the initiative and the Council on the adoption of the presidential statement on conflict-induced food insecurity. According to the 2023 State of Food Security and Nutrition Report, it is projected that almost 600 million people will still be facing hunger by 2030. In 2022 alone, 2.4 billion people lacked access to adequate, nutritious, safe, and sufficient food. The combination of impacts from the pandemic, climate shocks, high interest rates, high food and energy prices, and conflicts has put global food security and nutrition in dire straits, with armed conflict figuring as a prominent driver of hunger. Brazil believes that the best way to prevent hunger and malnutrition in the long term is to ensure that countries have the capacity to build resilient agri-food systems and markets. We must take into account structural causes of hunger, including inequalities between and within countries, barriers to food trade, unilateral sanctions, and weak or absent social protection and poverty alleviation policies. To ensure stability and continuity in food production, international attention must be given to supporting sustainable agricultural practices, developing disaster-resilient infrastructures, and promoting diversified agri-food systems. Ensuring the proper functioning of agri-food systems and markets is essential to sustain food security in conflict situations, as recognized in Resolution 2417/2018. Facilitating the transfer and access to efficient and productive technologies is central to ensuring diversified, resilient, and sustainable food systems. In line with the Secretary General Initiative on Early Warnings for All, the international community must support dedicated capacity building in developing countries to allow us to be better prepared for shocks on the availability and accessibility of food. To reach this goal, cash transfer programs should be prioritized to sustain both local supply and demand. Additionally, tools such as the IMF Food Shock Window or the Food Import Financing Facility proposed by FAO should be further explored to bridge financing needs while avoiding market distortions and disruptions. The reform of multilateral agricultural trade rules is also essential to prevent global food insecurity. Many countries affected by conflicts had their agricultural development restricted by trade and price-distorting subsidies that negatively affect their production capacities. Mr. President, an important element of this open debate refers to the collaboration between the Security Council, the UN system, and other actors to catalyze global efforts, ensure delivery of humanitarian assistance, and minimize the effects of conflict-induced food insecurity. Member states must fully incorporate in their work the tools already in place in the UN system to fight conflict-induced hunger. Bodies such as OCHA, the World Food Programme, and FAO diligently inform on risks of acute food insecurity in countries with conflict situations through different reports, including the White Notes mandated by Resolution 2417/2018, to which the Council must dedicate its full attention. An efficient response to conflict-induced famine must encompass the appropriate use of this information and timely and decisive action in response to it. International humanitarian law strictly prohibits starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, and grants special protection to objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, including food crops, livestock, and other essential resources necessary for food production. However, even when parties to a conflict comply with international humanitarian law, food systems can be disrupted by the secondary impacts of conflict. Humanitarian exemptions essential to the survival of the civilian population also need to be systematically included in sanctioned regimes and counterterrorism measures. Otherwise, humanitarian actors have to overcome complex legal, financial, and logistical roadblocks to ensure that those in need get appropriate assistance. Humanitarian needs play a central role, but they can be better supported if coupled with development-oriented measures such as dedicated agricultural, technical, and subsistence support. International cooperation, generous, sustained, result-oriented international cooperation in its many forms is essential to achieve this goal. Brazil has been active in promoting such cooperation with fellow developing countries, especially in Africa and Latin America, and we pledge to do more. Each situation of conflict presents different challenges for agri-food systems and the affected populations. For instance, as recently reported by FAO, in many cases, women are still more vulnerable to food and nutrition insecurity as they continue to face additional risks, barriers, and disadvantages due to their gender. Mr. President, our response to conflict-induced food insecurity must involve the three pillars of the United Nations. Humanitarian needs must be met, and its delivery allowed in an unimpeded and impartial manner. The Council must use its political capacity to push for solutions to conflicts that can alleviate challenges related to food accessibility. We will remain fully engaged in all these fronts and continue to be a firm advocate of the right of every person to sufficient, nutritious, and adequate food. I reaffirm the highest priority given by the Brazilian government to eliminate hunger in all situations and to achieve SDG 2 by 2030. The only assured way to end conflict-induced hunger is peace. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil, and I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. I congratulate the United States of America for assuming the presidency of the Council and for taking this initiative to hold this important debate that highlights the link between food insecurity and conflicts. I'd like to thank the UN Coordinator for Prevention and Response to Famine, Madam Rina Helani, for her valuable contribution. I listened very carefully to the briefing by Madam Naveen Salem and Mr. David Miliband. President, our debate is being held 1 week after the United Nations Summit on Food Systems. It called the world's attention onto the alarming proportions of famine around the world. It hammered home the urgency and the need to tackle this. Our meeting today is being held at a time when international security is raising more questions than answers. By adopting the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols, the peoples of the world have clearly and unanimously enshrined in their social contract that war has rules, and that belligerency is absolutely not a legal vacuum where all types of cruelty and atrocities may be permitted. This framework for war has connected us to our humanity even at the most troubled times. We cannot and we must not lose sight of the fact that famine is shameful. It is a grave violation of human dignity. It is even more intolerable when famine is planned or maintained, especially when resources are not lacking, as highlighted by Ms. Helani. Unfortunately, in various battlegrounds and hotbeds of tension around the world, famine is used as a weapon of war. As a result of senseless calculations, access to food is often impeded. The shortages that result from this very often lead to famine and diseases that are part of malnutrition and contribute to undoing the very social fabric of entire swathes of humanity. Civilians, and in particular women and children, are often the most exposed to its impact. When it is not used as a weapon of war, famine is very often a source of conflict and instability in fragile states. As Africans, we know of what we speak. On the African continent, more than 80% of people who are confronted with food insecurity live in zones affected by conflicts. The recent report of the United Nations on food security and nutrition around the world clearly highlights how famine can bring about armed conflict and drive forward other threats to peace and international security. Alongside this, armed conflicts can trigger and exacerbate humanitarian crises, poverty, and famine. These factors interact with one another and are mutually reinforcing, creating a vicious cycle of intolerable distress. President, Resolution 2417, adopted by this Council on the 24th of May 2018, recognizes just how tight the link is between armed conflict and food insecurity. The persistence of hunger challenges not only our humanity, but actually reduces to a fiction the efforts of the international community to bring an end to armed conflicts. In various regions of the world, especially in the Sahel, in the region of the Great Lakes, and in the Horn of Africa, armed groups and terrorist groups deliberately destroy food storage areas. They burn fields, they prevent peasants from cultivating their crops, they destroy infrastructure for production, transport, and distribution of foodstuffs. In these regions where instability has become chronic, children die of hunger. They are at the mercy of birds of prey. This situation is morally intolerable. We must respond as the Security Council. The peoples of the world have made us the custodians of the fate of their security and their dignity. Our response must go beyond superficial statements, and it must be commensurate with the challenge. The momentum behind our mobilization must be global in order to deal with the impacts of armed conflicts on food security around the world and ultimately prevent the emergence of new areas of famine. First of all, we must make a stronger commitment to finance adaptation to climate change and invest more in sustainable agriculture and long-term food security. This involves supporting small-scale farmers, improving agricultural infrastructure, and promoting agricultural practices that are respectful of the environment. The call to action of the Secretary-General of the United Nations to accelerate transformation of food systems deserves to be welcomed. It also should find a favorable response from all of us. Secondly, we must strengthen the mechanisms for emergency response to dealing with acute food crises. We should do so by strengthening early warning systems, by providing emergency food aid and coordinating efforts across humanitarian agencies and member states. Thirdly, we must ensure that emergency food reserves are ring-fenced, notably by consolidating the existing mechanisms for prevention, resolution, and post-conflict consolidation, and integrate them fully in the management of food crisis in compliance with the provisions of Resolution 2217 on hunger and security, Resolution 2573 on the protection of essential civilian infrastructure in times of conflict, and also Resolution 2417 that requires parties to a conflict not to obstruct the proper functioning of food systems and markets in conflict situations on the one hand, and by the same time offering technical assistance to fragile countries, both in the area of reserve storage and adequate technologies. President, it is clear that food insecurity is a threat to international peace and security. It also exacerbates humanitarian crises. Food insecurity is a reflection of the crisis of solidarity that is challenging us as representatives of the people of the world and as human beings. We must find a more effective way of responding to this and do so in a more concerted fashion without delay. Now more than ever, it is time that we tackle the underlying causes of conflicts. It is also fundamental that we promote dialogue, mediation, and diplomacy to resolve disputes and tensions that can lead to armed conflict. The prevention of conflict is a key factor to guaranteeing food security and halting the indignity that famine represents. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Gabon for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Madam President, I acknowledge the United States leadership on the important issue of global food insecurity, which thrice in your successive presidencies has found expression in the Council's work. I assure you of Ghana's support and cooperation during your presidency this month and congratulate Ambassador Barbara Woodward and the United Kingdom delegation for effectively leading the Council during the month of July. We also thank Ms. Rina Gelani, Mr. David Miliband, and Ms. Navin Salem for their briefing, which underscored the magnitude of famine globally and the severity of conflict-induced food insecurity, including for vulnerable countries and populations in Africa. Madam President, the stark reality of food insecurity across the world is alarming. 828 million people are reported to be suffering from hunger, and some 50 million people are on the brink of starvation. These numbers reflect the lives of real people and tell a harrowing story of our collective failure to address this most basic of human needs. 5 years since the adoption of Resolution 2417, conflict has remained a primary driver of acute food insecurity. However, food insecurity is not only a consequence of violent conflict. Combined with other factors, it can be a driver of violent conflict and a contributory factor for their emergence and length. In several places across the world, rising food and fuel prices have led to widespread unrest and instability. And on the African continent, where the fragilities are deep, sharp rises in food prices have often correlated with political dissatisfaction, protests, and agitations that have affected political stability. Today, as a result of the impact of the war in Ukraine, we see the disruptive influence of food insecurity in every country and on everyone. We are bound in our experience by the strong headwinds that the aggression against Ukraine has created in our socioeconomic circumstances. While we therefore welcome the recent announcement by the Russian Federation at the second Russia-Africa Summit to provide grain shipments to 6 African countries at no cost, we are concerned and deeply disappointed that the Black Sea Grain Initiative has not been renewed. A renewal of the initiative, accompanied by a resolution of challenges with the export of Russian ammonia, as well as agricultural products and fertilizers to global markets, represents a more durable way to prevent speculative spikes in global food prices and strengthen global food security while mitigating their knock-on effects. We therefore call on all parties to work constructively to ensure the renewal of the initiative. Madam President, as we reflect over the implementation of Resolution 2417 and the important contribution it has made in the past 5 years, Ghana believes that we must continue to be focused on the important task of breaking the destructive link between armed conflict and hunger by ensuring that the associated positive effects of food systems can promote peace and the supply of safe and nutritious food to civilians. In this regard, we continue to urge the international community to implement a series of emergency measures and simultaneously pursue long-term investments to break the vicious cycle of hunger and conflict. In respect of the immediate measures, Ghana urges for urgency and scaling of our actions to respond to the acute food insecurity and nutrition needs of the millions of vulnerable people in conflict situations around the world, especially in Africa, which is the hardest hit. We call on the international community and donor agencies to respond to the underfunded humanitarian response plans for African countries and to prioritize the implementation of the humanitarian response plans for countries in West Africa and the Sahel by helping to meet the $3.5 billion United States target required to tackle the increasing humanitarian needs. We also urge the strengthening of pre-positioned assets at global and regional humanitarian hubs to help interconnect food stocks quickly and effectively with the growing humanitarian needs. We encourage the deployment of strong efforts to reverse the rapid and dramatic deterioration in food security observed in conflict-affected settings and urge a unified call by the international community in demanding that parties to conflict comply with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. Madam President, we emphasize the need for long-term investments, especially in countries where there is an acute alignment between food insecurity and conflict. In relation to this, I will make three brief additional points. First, our actions must continue to emphasize the preservation of the peace, the prevention of conflicts, and the early deployment of pacific means for the resolution of disputes before they lead to violence between states or within a state. Second, our actions must focus on building resilience in economies and food systems. Besides acknowledging the effects that the climate change has on food insecurity and conflicts, our common efforts should also support efforts for adaptation measures in developing countries and agricultural initiatives such as the African Common Position for Sustainable Food Systems, the further implementation of the African Union's Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program and its results framework, regional food security facilities such as ECOWAS's Food Security Reserve, and the effective implementation of the African Development Bank facility to boost food security, nutrition, and resilience on the African continent. Thirdly, we need to bridge the gap between needs and supplies, especially for regions that may be experiencing drought conditions and where the impact of climate change-induced situations could aggravate conflicts. In this regard, we urge support for the accelerated implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area to help avert future food supply chain disruptions on the African continent. Madam President, in concluding, Ghana welcomes the adoption of today's presidential statement and would like to underscore the need to act with urgency, at scale, and in concert to respond to the urgent food security and nutrition needs of the millions of vulnerable people around the world, whose situations have been worsened by conflict. We must also be resolved to provide immediate humanitarian assistance, build resilience of the most vulnerable, and strengthen sustainable, resilient, and inclusive food systems in line with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its Sustainable Development Goals. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. And allow me to thank you for organizing today's important debate, and I wish you and your team every success in your presidency of the Council. Let me also thank the United Kingdom for presiding over the Council over the month of July. I also thank today's briefers for their powerful and compelling testimony, analysis, and direct calls to actions. Malta welcomes the adoption of this morning's PRST for today's meeting. Today, the world is experiencing an acute, alarming rise in food insecurity. This threatens not only the lives of millions, but the societal fabric in a myriad of countries across the globe, representing a grave threat to international peace and security. Arresting this crisis will require a response commensurate to the catastrophe itself, in which over 258 million people globally will require urgent and sustained aid. From Afghanistan to Haiti and Sudan, populations are already in crisis levels of hunger, with projections from leading famine, food and agriculture and humanitarian organizations stating that peak global hunger is projected for this December. As we know, this crisis is not gender neutral. Food insecurity and gender inequality are interlinked as women and girls often have less access and control over land, smallholder agricultural market support, and humanitarian assistance. The conflict in Sudan has severely disrupted the production of crops throughout the country, with estimates that 40% of the population, or 19 million people, are already facing alarming levels of hunger. As the conflict has disrupted farming, it has also disrupted sowing and harvesting. With limited access to seeds and fertilizers, the yield of the next season is in major doubt. Unless urgently addressed, this will compound hunger and guarantee human-induced famine in the months ahead. This situation would have catastrophic consequences for Sudan and the region, where agriculture is a principal source of income and livelihood for the majority of the population. President, just as conflict is a driver of hunger, violence can drive humanitarian operations out of areas of extreme danger. Violence often constrains access for medical and humanitarian organizations. Therefore, leading organizations to work where they can rather than where they are needed most. Today, we see instances of this in Haiti, Yemen, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Burkina Faso. In civil conflict, humanitarian access can be denied by way of arbitrary and bureaucratic measures. This Council should never accept such attempts to instrumentalize international law. Neither should we accept attempts at shielding such actions from this Council's scrutiny. We urge the UN to continue detailing such access impediments in their reports to this Council and in the White Notes mandated by Security Council Resolution 2417. While coordinating with the host state on the development of such documents, the UN must always assert its operational independence. Only by doing so can we collectively act in a timely manner. Furthermore, this Council must take seriously its obligations to ensure accountability for those who have ordered, participated in the destruction, or prevented the functionality of civilian infrastructure critical for the production of food. Impunity only begets further violations. From generals to local commanders, consequences must follow from violations. To this end, we also call on the UN to work closer with warring parties, especially states, to ensure that adequate deconfliction of such infrastructure in times of armed conflict is conducted. President, Malta regrets the Russian Federation's termination of its involvement in the Black Sea Grain Initiative. This initiative had ensured the safe passage of over 32 million metric tons of food commodities from Ukrainian ports, relieving hunger in some of the hardest hit corners of the world. We urge the Russian Federation to re-engage with the good offices of the Secretary General and reconsider the dramatic impacts this action will have. In conclusion, without urgent, coordinated humanitarian and emergency agricultural intervention, our inaction could condemn millions to starvation. From painful past experiences, we have learned that efforts to avert famine are effective when the international community works together in a goal-oriented manner. Greater resourcing for climate resilience, agricultural innovation, anticipatory action programs, and crucially early agricultural interventions is now paramount to stave off the worst of the coming global hunger crisis. Alleviating acute hunger is the first step on the road to peace building. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Madam President, Mozambique congratulates Your Excellency and the U.S. government for assuming the presidency of the Security Council. We pledge to cooperate fully with you and the United States team in the Security Council. We highly commend the United States for placing the topic famine and conflict-induced global food insecurity on the agenda of the Council for 3 consecutive years. In that connection, we welcome the presidential statement just adopted this morning. We wish to pay tribute to Her Excellency Ambassador Barbara Woodward of UK and the UK team as a whole for their excellent presidency of the Security Council in the month of July. We thank the distinguished briefers for their important insights on this important topic. Madam President, end hunger, achieve food security, improve nutrition, and promote agriculture is one of the stated goals of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. One of the major obstacles of achieving this noble goal is the growing incidence in the world of armed conflicts, terrorism, and other related factors. They affect food security, where the fightings take place and beyond. The conflicts disrupt and destroy food systems, decrease farming populations, destroy infrastructure, reduce resilience, and increase vulnerability. According to the Global Report on Food Crisis, armed conflicts and other threats to security pushed 139 million people into acute food insecurity in 2021. This is an increase of almost 40 million people compared to the year before. In 2022, the situation has worsened further as the impacts of the armed conflicts were felt across the globe. The 2023 report suggests that conflict pushed over 117 million people into acute food insecurity in the first half of the year alone, in addition to other negative factors such as economic shocks and extreme weather conditions. We come from Africa, a region where our heads of state and governments have committed themselves to a collective policy of silencing the guns and promoting development for peace and prosperity of our nations. We are therefore aware of this vicious link between insecurity and armed conflicts. Many countries in Africa and Asia are the focus of the attention of famine reporters. These are countries where the specter of food insecurity could be dramatic if an urgent and consistent humanitarian action is not taken. We believe cooperation and understanding between states or warring parties to extend humanitarian aid and safeguard the human dignity would immensely contribute to minimizing the suffering of those populations who live the tragedy of war on a daily basis. Mozambique stands in solidarity with all populations that in the aftermath of various conflicts, including those motivated by transnational terrorists, are forced to leave their production areas, thereby increasing the pressure for humanitarian aid. We defend the creation of conditions for access to humanitarian aid without hindrance, in full compliance with international humanitarian law. Madam President, countering prevailing gloom situation requires, among other things, an in-depth knowledge of the evolving threats and challenges we are confronted with. It also requires the ability to reach the affected segments of population, provide them with individualized and well-timed support in response to their needs, and strengthen their positive coping mechanisms. This is best done through partnership and collaboration that reinforce existing support structures and leverage the comparative advantages of the many organizations and entities present in any humanitarian crisis, taking into account the local, national, and regional realities. To achieve this end, Mozambique encourages the adoption of a humanitarian, integrated, and inclusive approach based on an intersectoral coordination at all levels between local, national, regional, and international partners. Public and private sector should be included in order to ensure sustainable food and nutritional security for needy populations with a view to creating sustainable food systems. Madam President, based on our own experience in Mozambique, we are of the view that food security at national or international level comes with peace and a normalization of people's lives. It comes with the will and the strength to negotiate and settle peacefully the disputes everywhere they arise. In the meanwhile, to mitigate dire humanitarian situations, some actions must be taken, individually or collectively, by states, donors, and organizations that include: 1, strengthening the productive capacity of concerned countries by facilitating access to production technologies, including adequate funding for agriculture, livestock, and fisheries sectors in order to prevent conflicts. 2, lifting all constraints, barriers, and protection measures to the distribution chain of fertilizers and inputs. 3, encouraging strict compliance with obligations under international humanitarian law, reminding all parties to conflicts that indispensable objects for the survival of civilians are to be respected and safeguarded. 4, providing technical assistance and inclusion of groups most vulnerable to conflict in food systems value chains. These include women, youth, and individuals with disabilities. Madam President, Mozambique calls on the Security Council to do all in its power towards achieving a cessation of hostilities in all conflicts that continue to claim human lives in the world. It is our duty under the Charter to free innocent civilians from the scourge of war and from perpetual situation of hunger and famine. We urge the United Nations member states to channel all means and resources to the attainment of peace, security, and stability. These are, in our view, the solid foundations for promoting and building global food security worldwide. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I thank Ms. Golani, Mr. Miliband, and Ms. Salam for their briefings. Food issue concerns people's livelihoods and security. It is complex and sensitive. It has a wide linkage to production and supply chains and is one of the long-term and recurrent global challenges. The Security Council is highly concerned about this issue and has taken positive actions from different perspectives, including the adoption of Resolution 2417, which sets clear requirements for protecting civilians and agricultural facilities and increasing humanitarian inputs in armed conflicts. The international community should work together to promote the implementation and effectiveness of relevant Council resolutions, adhere to political settlement of disputes, and break the vicious cycle of conflict and famine. At present, the global food security situation is getting worse. The data shown in UN reports and the situation introduced by the briefers are shocking and worrying. China supports UN agencies in utilizing their professional advantages and coordinating roles by mobilizing the international community, especially developed countries, to increase humanitarian assistance and to fill the funding gap in global humanitarian response so as to alleviate the urgent needs of people in relevant countries. While addressing urgent issues, in order to thoroughly solve the food crisis, it is necessary to focus on the root causes and conduct a systematic review. The biggest victims of the food crisis are all developing countries without exception. Food insecurity is essentially the results of insufficient and unbalanced development on a global scale, and is a concrete manifestation of the development gap between the North and the South. It is closely related to the long-standing unjust and unreasonable food production and trade system and international governance system. The international community should seize the opportunity of the SDG Summit in September and the Summit for the Future next year to address both the symptoms and root causes, to improve rules and regulations and take comprehensive measures to achieve the goal of zero hunger in 2030 as scheduled. I would like to make the following points. First, firmly establish the concept of common security. The causes of food crisis are complex and is intertwined with other traditional and non-traditional security issues. Without the common security of the international community, it is difficult to have sustainable food security. We should uphold a common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security concept, stay committed to settling disputes in peaceful manners, and advocate dialogue, and respond to various challenges such as food insecurity with a spirit of unity and win-win mindset. We must firmly oppose unilateral sanctions and actions that affect international food security and global cooperation, such as decoupling and disrupting supply chain, disrupting market order, or suppressing enterprises from other countries. China urges relevant countries to immediately stop such practice that lack legal foundations and is also in contrary to fairness and justice. The Black Sea Grain Initiative and the MOU on Russia's grain and fertilizer exports have a positive impact on maintaining global food security. At present, the window of opportunity for restoring the package agreement still exists. China hopes that all relevant parties will intensify dialogue and consultation, meet each other halfway, strive to balance and solve the legitimate concerns of all parties, and restore the exports of food and fertilizers from Russia and Ukraine as soon as possible. China supports the Secretary General and relevant parties in continuing efforts to this end. Second, bridge the development gap between North and South with a fastened pace. Sustainable development is the most fundamental guarantee for achieving common food security. The international community should address the issue of food insecurity in the context of sustainable development and take advantage of the stock-taking moments of 2023, such as the SDG Summit and the UN Food System Summit. Listen carefully to the voice of developing countries, strengthen North-South dialogue and coordination, gather more development resources, and build greater development synergies. We should vigorously assist developing countries in need to solve problems in areas such as agriculture, rural areas, and farmers to enhance resilience to climate change and natural disasters and increase food production and self-sufficiency. Developed countries should cancel unreasonable agricultural subsidies and adopt reasonable monetary policies, reduce the impact of imported inflation, exchange rates and fluctuations, and other factors on food security in developing countries. At the same time, it is necessary to earnestly fulfill their ODA commitments, refrain from technology lockdowns and the practice of small yards and high fence. Rather, we should accelerate the technology transfer, application, and sharing of knowledge in areas such as biology, digital, and space to create a better condition for developing countries to strengthen capacity building and achieve sustainable development. Third, improve the global food and agriculture governance system. The international grain market has long faced problems such as monopoly of pricing power by major grain merchants, structural imbalance in the production and supply chain, and high monetization of agriculture products. Certain countries has indiscriminately implemented unilateral coercive measures, causing serious difficulties in agriculture and economic development of the targeted countries. The international community should attach great importance to these persistent problems that undermine global food security and promote their solutions, and take an overall consideration in the preparation process of the SDG Summit and the Future Summit, improve global food and agriculture governance from an institutional and rules-making levels, and focusing on increasing the representation, voice, and decision-making power of developing countries. Efforts should be made to remove the restrictions of unilateral sanctions on food production and exports, combat speculative capitals and price monopoly, to build a safe, stable, efficient, open, inclusive, and mutually beneficial supply chain system, as well as a more fair and reasonable international food trade order. Madam President, actions speak louder than words. China has made contributions to maintaining global food security with proactive actions. China has proposed global development initiatives and international food security cooperation initiative, advocating for deepening practical food cooperation. We have been assisting developing countries in the form of funding, technology, and market to improve their food production, storage, and loss reduction capabilities. China has carried out agriculture cooperation with more than 140 countries and regions, promoted more than 1,000 agriculture technologies to developing countries, trained more than 14,000 professionals in hybrid rice technology for more than 80 developing countries, and we have also provided emergency food aid to countries in need. We stand ready to work with other countries to make greater contributions to global food security with deepened exchanges and cooperation. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madam President, I congratulate you and thank the United States for convening this open debate on a very important subject. This also follows the meeting organized by the British presidency on July 17th, in which the Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs took part. And I also thank each of the briefers for their enlightening statements. The year 2022 has been a dark year for food security. And after the Russian withdrawal from the Black Sea deal, we can fear the worst for the coming months. This acute crisis affects the whole world, and it is severely hitting the most vulnerable and poorest countries. And I'd like to begin with that point. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine continues to aggravate an already very worrying situation caused through the multiplication of armed conflicts, the impact of climate change, the erosion of biodiversity, and the COVID-19 pandemic. Russia is directly responsible for the aggravation of this multifaceted conflict. Deaf to the efforts of the Secretary General and Turkey, it unilaterally and abruptly put an end to the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which allowed grain to be transported to 45 countries and to vulnerable populations, including via humanitarian aid through the World Food Program. It allowed to stabilize world prices and avoid shortages. By depriving Ukrainian grain of access to world markets, by blocking navigation in the Black Sea, Russia is directly threatening world food security and the supply of the most affected countries. It also seeks to destroy Ukrainian production and export capacities, including by bombing port infrastructure and grain terminals, in complete violation of international law. Its goal is to stifle the Ukrainian agricultural system, not only in order to reduce Ukraine's income, but also to assume a dominant market position and serve its own economic interests and those of its agricultural businesses. The increase in grain prices that it intends to cause would be to its benefit, but to the detriment of all the other countries. And so, after exercising unacceptable blackmail for the renewal of the Black Sea Agreement, Russia now adds irresponsibility to cynicism in its instrumentalization of the world food crisis. Russia must immediately stop using hunger as a weapon of war. Madam President, the response to food insecurity and malnutrition is everyone's responsibility. France is fully committed to this effort and immediately took the initiative to respond to the global food crisis by launching a number of initiatives such as Farm and Harvest Rescue. We have thus mobilized more than 900 million euros for emergency food aid, agricultural resilience, and the development of agricultural systems in the most vulnerable countries, including 160 million euros for the World Food Program. This is double the amount compared to 2021. I recall that in the same period, Russia has cut its contribution to the WFP by half, while it also deprives it of Ukrainian wheat. With our European partners, we support the solidarity corridors put in place by the EU, which have made it possible to transport 41 million tons of grain products out of Ukraine since March 22. They are currently the only transport route for Ukrainian grain, and we intend to strengthen them. France will continue to take the lead in the coming months and will host the first global meeting of the School Meals Coalition in Paris in October of this year. This initiative, this coalition, sets the goal of enabling each child to benefit from at least one healthy, nutritious meal daily. This is something that represents a social safety net, but also a lever to promote school attendance. France will also host the next Nutrition for Growth Summit. Madam President, as food insecurity reaches unprecedented levels, respect for international humanitarian law is imperative to allow the delivery of aid to populations in need. France recalls that deliberately starving civilians constitutes a war crime. This crime must not go unpunished. Humanitarian assistance must be able to be delivered safely, quickly, and without hindrance to all those in need. And as the briefers recalled, access to aid is key. It is critical for countries that are at the highest risk of famine. France also calls today for the lifting of obstacles to the delivery of humanitarian assistance for the population of Nagorno-Karabakh through the Lachin corridor, as well as obstacles to movement in accordance with the order of the ICJ this February. At a time when the humanitarian space is shrinking, France reiterates its full and complete support for humanitarian actors in the exercise of their difficult missions. France supports the draft presidential statement put forward by the United States and thanks them. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Madam President, I thank you for convening this debate. I also thank the briefers for their valuable statements. Ecuador aligns itself with the statement that is to be delivered by the delegation of Ireland on behalf of the group of friends on action on conflict and hunger that we co-chair. How hard was it for this Council to adopt Resolution 2417 in 2018 on hunger and conflict? Today,
of the Security Council this month to focus in on the rising challenge of global food insecurity. We've seen an almost perfect storm emerge in recent years, a combination of climate change, of COVID, and now particularly of conflict that is driving this food insecurity. There are now about 260 million people around the world who are acutely food insecure. And in turn, this food insecurity itself drives conflict, it drives forced migration, it stunts growth, both physical growth and economic growth. It holds countries back, it holds people back. The flip side of the coin is we're also increasingly seeing food being used as a weapon of war, for leverage, for political purposes, in conflict after conflict. So we wanted to put the focus on both of these challenges, rising food insecurity and at the same time the use of food as a weapon of war. We just have 91 countries commit in a joint communique to ending the use of food as a tool of war. That in and of itself is a powerful statement, and we urge others to join. Of course, the place where we're seeing this most immediately and most acutely is in Ukraine, where as part of Russia's aggression, it initially blockaded Ukraine's ports, in effect blocking the export of grains to the world that Ukraine had been a key country for providing. Then, thanks to the good work of the United Nations Secretary General and Turkey, an agreement was put in place that allowed grain to flow through the Black Sea Grain Initiative. While that agreement was in force, more than 30 million tons of grain were able to get out of Ukraine and to markets around the world. Well over half of that to developing countries, and in fact 2/3 of the wheat to developing countries. It was the equivalent of 18 billion loaves of bread. A few weeks ago, Russia tore up that agreement. The result has been rising prices for countries around the world. The result has been a diminution in the access to these food products, particularly for developing countries. And as we've seen, Russia's actions since then, not only in tearing up the deal, but in intentionally targeting food silos in Ukraine, literally destroying food, as well as the means to produce it, while holding ports and sea lanes at risk to prevent countries from shipping these products out of Ukraine and to the people who need it. I think we've heard from around the world a chorus of condemnation for this action. and the strong desire on the part of many, many countries that this arrangement be put back in place. And it's very simple. It's on Russia to decide whether to do so. Of course, it could end the war that it started tomorrow, and that would solve the problem definitively. But short of that, at the very least, the world is insisting that it restore the Black Sea Grain Initiative. The urgent assistance that we're providing to countries around the world, not just in the context of Ukraine, but of other serious risks of famine, has been significant. Over the last year and a half, the United States has provided an additional $14.5 billion in food assistance to countries around the world. We are the largest contributor by far to the World Food Program, 50% of its budget every single year. And today, I was able to announce another $360 million in assistance to combat food insecurity in Haiti and 11 African countries. But for all of the emergency assistance that we're providing and others are providing, it's not enough. The United Nations, and particularly the World Food Program, has determined that right now we need to address the food insecurity of well over 100 million people around the world, $25 billion. To date, only $4.5 billion of that has been pledged by various countries. We have to do better. We have to do more. We have to do it now. Finally, as important as these urgent appeals are, and as important as the work that we're doing to address immediate needs are, we also have to take a long-term perspective and make sure that we are acting on that as well. By 2050, it is estimated that the population of this planet could be as many as 10 billion people. Demand for food is likely to increase by 50% over what it is today. And yet, yields, what's actually being produced, are going down, not up. We have to, and we are, addressing this challenge. I spoke today at the Council about one of the initiatives the United States is advancing. That is a vision for adapted crops and soil. And simply put, what that means is this. We know that we have the ability to produce seeds for planting that are resilient, certainly more resilient to climate change in all of its various manifestations, and are much more nutritious than some of the things being planted today. We also know that the quality of soil makes all the difference in the world, and we now have the ability to map pretty much any terrain anywhere in the world to determine the quality of its soil, where it's good, where it's bad, where we can improve it, and how we can improve it. You put those two things together, seeds and soil, and you can powerfully address the challenge of producing sustainable agricultural production capacity with better yields, more nutritious crops in a sustainable way. We are putting $100 million to that effort. Other countries are joining in, and we expect to see significantly more come forward in the weeks and months ahead. This is a powerful new way to really make a difference over the long term in making sure that we have strong agricultural capacity and production around the world, and notably in Africa. So let me stop there, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Edith Lutteroff from the Associated Press. On the Black Sea Grain Initiative, we understand that the Russians have made some indication that they might want to revive talks. They say that despite there being no sanctions, there are still issues with banking, financing, insurance, shipping, etc. What is the United States prepared to do to try and help overcome those issues if and when talks resume? And on Niger, the ECOWAS, the regional organization, gave a week for the military leaders to restore the president to power. That expires Sunday. They have threatened to use force if that doesn't happen? What is the U.S. position? Thank you.
Edith, thank you very much. First, with regard to Russia and grain, to be very clear, the sanctions imposed by us and others for Russia's aggression in Ukraine have from day one exempted its own food products. And that includes not just the food products, but the means to ship them and insure them. And in fact, just now, if you look at where Russian exports are, its exports of food exceed what they were before its aggression against Ukraine. Having said that, to the extent that there have been any problems with things like shipping and insurance, we have, throughout the process of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, taken steps to work through them and to address them, including, for example, writing comfort letters to banks to assure them that it was fine to process these transactions and that they wouldn't run afoul of our sanctions. So, in the event of return to the agreement, of course, we'll continue to do whatever is necessary to make sure that everyone can export their food and food products freely and safely, to include Russia. We want to see that food on world markets. We want everyone to benefit from the lower prices. With regard to Niger, we strongly support the very strong leadership of ECOWAS on Niger. I don't want to get ahead of where things are, but what ECOWAS has done in terms of stating very clearly that there's an expectation for a return to the constitutional order and a continuation of the democratic process, and putting pressure on those responsible for interrupting the democratic order and constitutional order in Niger. We stand very much behind that. We will work closely with ECOWAS, with other concerned countries. I don't want to get ahead of where things are right now, but we believe that the work that ECOWAS is doing and the statements it's made are important, strong, and have our support.
Will Malden in the back.
Hey, Will.
Thank you so much. Just to clarify on Edie's question, so the U.S. has not taken a position of supporting military force by ECOWAS, by the African group within Niger. Just so I understand what you're saying, but would the U.S. provide logistical or other support to such an intervention in the country? And then on the grain issue, I wanted to ask you, barring a return to the grain initiative, are there other ways to get Ukrainian grain onto the high seas?
Okay. Thanks, Will. Again, on ECOWAS, we support what they've said. We are working closely with ECOWAS, with concerned countries. I don't want to get ahead of where we are now. We'll see how the coming days play out. But as I said, we believe it is vitally important that what ECOWAS has called for actually take effect, and that is the freeing of President Bazoum and a restoration of the constitutional order in Niger. And we support the efforts that ECOWAS is making, including the pressure that it's exerting in order to achieve that result. Short of returning to the Black Sea Grain Initiative, of course, we're looking at every option to maximize the export of grains from Ukraine, including by land routes, which are already in effect, potentially by sea and river routes, rail, etc. Having said that, as I see it right now, even maximizing those other routes, it will be very difficult to make up what we were doing, what Ukraine was able to do with the Black Sea Grain Initiative. In other words, the volumes, I think, will be hard to match. And even if, for example, there was an effective and safe way to move things by sea from the south, the fact that Russia is targeting the ports, targeting the production facilities, the storage facilities, the grain itself, as long as that continues, it's going to be incredibly difficult. So I think that's what we really have to be looking at, is what does Russia do? And as I said earlier in the Council, it's not about what we're saying, Manny. It's quite literally what virtually everyone in that Council is saying, and so many members of this body, of the United Nations. The Kenyan Foreign Ministry called what Russia did in tearing up the grain deal a stab in the back. And that is reflective of what many countries around the world feel. Russia has to address that.
Michelle Williams from Reuters. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Michelle Nichols from Reuters. A follow-up on Niger. Have any ECOWAS countries notified the US of their plans for potential military action once this deadline expires on Sunday? And on China, you've invited Foreign Minister Wang Yi to come and visit in DC. Has he formally accepted that invitation, and when might that visit take place?
Thank you. On ECOWAS, I'd really invite you to address questions to them about their planning, their timelines, etc. But as I said before, we're in close contact with them, with a number of other countries. I've also been in direct contact with President Bazoum multiple times, including as recently as yesterday. Other actors on the ground in Niger, and I just don't want to get into hypotheticals now. We're playing this out one day at a time, and we are looking for the restoration of the constitutional order in Niger. With regard to China, as you know, when I was in China, I invited the then Foreign Minister, Qin Gang, to come to the United States at a mutually convenient time. We were looking at the fall. I have, in fact, extended that invitation to Wang Yi, who is now serving as Foreign Minister. We don't have a response yet, but we just extended that invitation. And I would expect we'll have an opportunity to see each other and to continue the important conversations that I had in Beijing, that a number of my colleagues in the cabinet had, including Secretary Yellen, John Kerry. Others will be going, and we fully expect Chinese counterparts to come to the United States. As you've heard me say, I think there's an obligation that both the United States and China responsibly manage this relationship. That starts with talking, including dealing directly with our very serious differences, as well as seeing if we can find areas for cooperation that would benefit our own people and benefit many people around the world. And again, all of that starts with engaging, with talking, with being very clear and direct with one another. That's why it would be beneficial to continue these conversations, and I'll look forward one way or another to seeing the Foreign Minister. As you know, I saw him on the margins of the meetings recently in Indonesia, in Jakarta, and I would look forward to seeing him in the United States. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
The duplicity of our former Western partners was even more clear in their arrogant unwillingness to fulfill the second part of the deal, the Russia-UN memorandum on the supply of Russian food and fertilizers to world markets. And this is despite the fact that Russia's share of the global wheat market is 20%, while Ukraine's is less than 5%. This means that Russia makes a significant contribution to global food security and is a solid, responsible international supplier of agricultural products, not to mention the exceptional role played by Russian fertilizers in global food security. It would seem that given these obvious facts, Western countries need to focus on ensuring that Russian grain and fertilizers can get to countries in need without hindrance. Yet, this is not part of our Western colleagues' plans. This was unambiguously confirmed by you the day before yesterday, Madam President. So how can we talk about any kind of desire on your country's part to address international food security issues? All that drives you is the desire to punish Russia and your pipe dreams of dealing it a strategic defeat. You do not care the slightest bit about the interests of the countries of the global south, but we do. Therefore, I repeat once again that if all the problems that have been publicly raised by us, including in this chamber, regarding the implementation of the Russia-UN memorandum are eliminated, we will be ready to once again take part in the Black Sea Initiative. Dear colleagues, Western delegations today poured forth numbers detailing the humanitarian aid rendered by them to developing countries. Whether this is enough to compensate for the damage caused by centuries of cruel colonial policies of plundering natural resources and exploiting populations is not for us to judge, but rather for those states that have suffered from it. Do Western countries help a lot or a little? It's not polite to count other people's money, but it's hard not to notice that the amount of assistance provided by the U.S. and its allies to the countries of the global south cannot be compared to what the West has spent on weapons in less than 2 years for its proxy war with Russia to the last Ukrainian. According to the most conservative estimates, this amounts to 80 billion euros, while the total amount of funds allocated to Ukraine is 165 billion euros. And this is given that OCHA requested $55.2 billion from donors for all of its humanitarian operations for 2023, and only 24.8% of this amount has been funded to date. Can you imagine how much good could be done in the world if the U.S. and its allies were as willing to spend money on development assistance as they are on sponsoring wars around the world? But now I want to draw attention to something else. Despite all of their benevolent slogans, donor assistance from Western states is not selfless and always comes with political preconditions. A clear example of this is the situation with the cross-border humanitarian mechanism for Syria, where Western states are essentially openly blackmailing the Syrian people seeking a change of power. Another example is the threats we're hearing now from Josep Borrell, as well as the leadership of the UK, France, and the US to stop helping Niger. Did people suddenly stop starving there after the coup? It's obvious, in other words, that all of this humanitarian aid is being used by the West solely as a tool of control over states that are forced to resort to it. The needs of the population are not taken into account in this. Dear colleagues from developing countries, make no mistake, the habits and methods of former colonizers have not changed. Only the packaging has. For every dollar allegedly spent on aid, they will demand that you pay with your sovereignty and political independence. Many African states have already experienced this firsthand and don't want to put up with such an approach. And this is something that makes Mr. Borrell lose sleep in his garden. He suddenly decided today that selling grain at low prices, Russia somehow making its buyers dependent. I won't comment on the perverted logic of the head of EU diplomacy. I will simply say that the facts are not in its favor. Russia has never considered Africa, Asia, or Latin America as a space for extracting profits. Despite all of the obstacles put in place by the U.S. and its allies, we have helped, are helping, and will continue to help those in need around the world free of charge. We have built and will continue building factories, schools, hospitals, and universities so that you can use your natural resources to create goods with added value instead of exporting raw materials, and so that your young people can stay home rather than leaving the country en masse. We understand the importance of the uninterrupted supply of food to African countries. This is important for socioeconomic development and for maintaining political stability. That is why we're particularly focused on shipments of wheat, barley, corn, and other grains to our African friends, including through the UN World Food Program. Last year, trade in agricultural products between Russia and African countries grew by 10% and amounted to $6.7 billion, whereas in the first 6 months of this year, it has increased by another record 60%. Russia exported 11.5 million tons of grain to Africa in 2022, and just in the first 6 months of this year, we have already exported nearly 10 million. And I want to stress that this has all taken place despite the illegal unilateral sanctions imposed on our exports, which seriously impede the supply of Russian food and complicate transportation, logistics, insurance, and bank payments. Moreover, as announced at the recent Russia-Africa summit, we will be able to provide Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, Mali, Somalia, the Central African Republic, and Eritrea with 25 to 50,000 tons of grains free of charge in the coming months, and we will ensure the free delivery of this as well. I also recall our readiness to donate mineral fertilizers to the poorest countries in need. Of the 262,000 tons of these fertilizers that are currently blocked in European ports, only 2 shipments have been sent so far, 20,000 tons to Malawi and 34,000 to Kenya. The rest remains in the hands of European states. And this is despite the fact that we're talking about a purely humanitarian effort to which no sanctions should apply in principle. Dear colleagues, we believe that the vast majority of countries, including African ones, which are seeing an alarming trend in the area of food security, have sufficient fertile lands. That is, there is a foundation there for building food sovereignty, and it must be strengthened not through humanitarian aid, but through the implementation of projects in the area of sustainable development as a whole, the transfer of necessary technologies, fertilizers, weather-resistant seeds. We are convinced that with the use of appropriate agricultural technologies and proper organization of agricultural production, Africa will in the future not only be able to feed itself and ensure its own food security, but also become an exporter of various types of food. For its part, Russia is ready to share its expertise with African states and other interested developing countries in the area of agricultural production and assist in implementing cutting-edge technologies. Unlike Western neo-colonialists, we're interested in building a more equitable system of resource distribution, so that developing states are not forever hooked on the needle of politically conditioned humanity, which is nothing other than primitive blackmail. This is so that they can overcome the challenges of the transitional period, form strong, sustainable, self-sufficient economies, which can help ensure social stability and the well-being of the population. In other words, this will give them complete freedom in exercising their sovereignty and making all domestic and foreign policy decisions. Russia is ready to help you with this in every possible way. Madam President, we note the work carried out by our American colleagues in advance of today's meeting to agree on a statement by the President of the Security Council on Hunger and Conflicts. Despite the fact that this document did not end up incorporating all the provisions we proposed, we considered it possible to support it in the spirit of compromise. The consequences of illegitimate unilateral restrictive measures and sanctions that have a direct negative impact on food security in the world have been left out of the document. It would have also been appropriate to recall paragraph 3 of Article 54 of the additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions of 1949, according to which the prohibitions on attacking or destroying agricultural infrastructure do not apply if such infrastructure is used as sustenance for the members of the armed forces or in direct support of military action. During today's debate, the representative of Venezuela will speak on behalf of the group of Friends of the UN Charter. We associate ourselves with this statement, which reflects in a much fuller way the approach to solving problems that are a focus of our meeting today. Madam President, in conclusion, I wish to say that because the importance of Russian food and fertilizers is so great for the socioeconomic development and food security of the countries of Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, the choice now lies with you and your allies. Until the illegitimate obstacles artificially created by the West affecting Russian economic operators' ability to supply agricultural products are eliminated, it will hardly be possible to restore the normal functioning of supply chains and address other global food security issues. No matter you may try to shift the blame to Russia, the facts are not in your favor. So you must therefore decide what is more important for the U.S. and its allies, geopolitical considerations or the desire to help the developing world. If it's the former, then there is no need to mislead anyone, including by initiating debates like today's and drawing up beautiful joint documents. What we need is not words, but actions. We have been and remain ready to participate in joint efforts to strengthen international food security. Are you? We have serious doubts about that. Thank you.
I thank the Russian Federation for their statement. I wish to remind all speakers to limit their statements to no more than 3 minutes in order to enable the Council to carry out its work expeditiously. Flashing lights on the collars of the microphones will prompt speakers to bring their remarks to a close after 3 minutes. I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Vahi Zhavargan, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Armenia.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. I would like to express my appreciation to the United States for convening this open debate on such a pertinent topic. I thank Ms. Rina Ghalani, UN Famine Prevention and Response Coordinator, and other distinguished briefers for presenting their views on the ways to prevent and address famine by strengthening the food security in conflict situations. Starvation has been repeatedly used as a method of warfare and perpetration of genocide throughout history. But today I'm not going to recall examples from the past or assess future risks of famine in the context of the conflict. Instead, I would like to bring to the attention of the Council a situation which is happening right now, situation wherein people do not know whether today they will be able to find milk formula for their babies, loaf of bread for their children, or provide medicines to critically ill relatives. As we meet, the people of Nagorno-Karabakh face threat to their very existence resulting from the complete blockade imposed by Azerbaijan. For more than 7 months, Azerbaijan continues to block the Lachin corridor, a humanitarian lifeline connecting Nagorno-Karabakh with the outside world. This illegal and inhumane action is in blatant violation of the order of International Court of Justice of 22 February 2023, reaffirmed by July 6 order, norms of international humanitarian law, and the trilateral statement of 9 November 2020. The complete halt of any humanitarian supplies by Azerbaijan since 15 June this year has led to a critical shortage of food, medical supplies, and other essential goods, creating a full-fledged humanitarian crisis. Disruption of electricity and gas supplies has been paralyzing social and healthcare services and transportation system, depriving the besieged population of their fundamental human rights. The blockade has a particular devastating impact on the most vulnerable segments of the population. Due to the lack of essential foods and vitamins, approximately 2,000 pregnant women, around 30,000 children, 20,000 elder persons, and 9,000 persons with disabilities are struggling to survive under conditions of malnutrition, absence of basic supplies and medicines. Moreover, Azerbaijan continuously targets civilians conducting agricultural works, augmenting its manifest intent to impose starvation on the population. These warning signs have already been communicated by the ICRC, which remains the only international humanitarian mission in Nagorno-Karabakh. In its July 25 news release, the International Committee of the Red Cross expressed concern over growing humanitarian needs and emphasized that it's not currently able to bring humanitarian assistance to the civilian population through the Lachin corridor, while stressing that its humanitarian aid convoys are a lifeline for the population in the area. After 3 days of this communication, Azerbaijan arrested 68-year-old Vagiv Khachatryan, a person who was being transported by ICRC from Nagorno-Karabakh to Armenia for medical treatment. The arrest of a person under ICRC protection whose transfer was preliminarily agreed with Azerbaijan is not merely a perfidious act, but well-calculated obstruction of the ICRC work in Nagorno-Karabakh. To address life-saving needs of the most vulnerable, on 26 July, the government of Armenia decided to deliver a consignment of around 360 tons of essential goods, mainly food and medical supplies, to Nagorno-Karabakh. We appealed to the peacekeeping forces of the Russian Federation to organize the delivery of the humanitarian assistance to those in need, which was established practice through past months. However, up until now, the humanitarian cargo remains at the entrance to the Lachin corridor due to the obstruction and denial by Azerbaijani side of its transfer. Madam President, The dire humanitarian situation on the ground and risks of evolving hunger in Nagorno-Karabakh require efficient and timely response by the international community to ensure full and unconditional implementation of the ICJ decisions and full respect of international human rights and international humanitarian law. We hope that yesterday's statement of the UN Secretary General, wherein he expressed deep concern on humanitarian situation and emphasized the need of implementation of ICJ orders for ensuring unimpeded movement of persons, vehicles, and cargo along Lachin corridor, will be the first step towards full UN engagement on the ground. This engagement is as needed as ever. The cost of inaction is too high to be sustained, and this mass atrocity being perpetrated through starvation should and can be prevented and stopped. We call on the UN and its Security Council to undertake urgent measures to ensure full adherence of Azerbaijan to its legally binding obligations under ICJ orders and the international humanitarian law, immediately restore the freedom of movement across the Lachin corridor, and allow safe and unimpeded humanitarian access of the UN agencies and the ICRC to Nagorno-Karabakh. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Gevorgyan for his statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Geraldo Penalver Porto, First Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba.
Madam President, we align ourselves with this statement that is to be delivered by the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela on behalf of the Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations. At the World Summit on Food that was held in 1996, the historic leader of the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro Ruz, denounced the root causes of inequalities and hunger when he said as follows: "It is capitalism, neoliberalism, the laws of unbridled market, external debt, underdevelopment, unequal exchange that kill so many people around the world. A profoundly unjust, anti-democratic and exclusionary order persists. It has provoked an exponential growth in hunger, poverty and food insecurity. The current multidimensional global crisis has contributed to increasing the gaps between the North, that is increasingly wealthy, and the South, that is increasingly poor and marginalized. There is a proliferation of protectionist policies and speculative practices of big capital that have sent food prices soaring. The irrational patterns of capitalist production and consumption continue destroying the ecological balance of the planet. Trillions of dollars are invested and wasted in military spending instead of being used to protect life and contribute to sustainable development. Against this complex backdrop, there have been also increases in unilateral coercive measures and illegal blockades such as the one exercised against Cuba. The government of the US has converted this recurrent criminal punishment against millions of people into a flagship of its foreign policy by means of measures aimed at strangling the economy of many countries with a view to obtaining political advantage. The main obstacle to food security of the Cuban people is the economic, commercial and financial blockade that has been imposed for more than 60 years by the government of the United States of our country in the arbitrary list of states that purportedly sponsor terrorism. This cruel policy has a staggering impact on all sectors of life in our country and derails economic development, social development, as well as the implementation of Agenda 2030. The embargo is a grave, flagrant and systematic violation of the human rights of the Cuban people, including the rights to food and development. The Security Council, with its limited composition, is scarcely a representation of the entire international community and should adjust its mandate and stop interfering in areas outside of its remit. The General Assembly is the body that is called on to lead international efforts to achieve the goals set out under SDG 2, ending hunger, achieving food security and improved nutrition, and promoting sustainable agriculture. We must bring about a fair, democratic and equitable international order that allows us to unearth the root causes of poverty and hunger and promote development, sustainable development for all people, eliminating potential causes of conflict that affect international security. We need international cooperation, solidarity, multilateralism to guarantee full realization of all of these rights to food and to development. Cuba will continue firmly developing these goals together with the countries of the Global South. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Porto for his statement. I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Wojciech Żerwel, Undersecretary of State of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Poland.
Madam President, Excellencies, I wish to thank the United States for convening this important and timely debate. Poland aligns itself with the statement to be delivered by the European Union. We believe that the strong focus on famine and conflict-induced global food insecurity is now of crucial importance. Hunger should not be a weapon of war. Global food supply chains cannot be taken hostage by aggressors in order to achieve their military goals. As stated in the recent UN Interagency Report on the state of food security and nutrition in the world, global hunger is still far above pre-pandemic levels. In this context, let me first address two questions posed in the excellent concept paper presented by the United States prior to this debate, namely the importance of anticipatory action and the role of investments to tackle the root causes of food insecurity. International community should focus on building resilience of local food systems. Countries that can increase their own food production and build their own distribution systems are less vulnerable to conflict and climate-induced insecurity that ultimately result in famine. Public-private partnerships should be mobilized to building reliable transport and storage infrastructure. Such actions are undertaken through the Global Gateway Strategy of the European Union, or the 3Cs initiative of 12 Central European nations. Poland built on these examples when initiating the UN General Assembly resolution emphasizing the critical role of resilient infrastructure in safeguarding the delivery of essential goods and services. Madam President, even if we cannot prevent all new conflicts or stop the existing ones, we can start to counter the food insecurity crisis right now. It is worth considering the International Monetary Fund recommendations. First, rapidly and adequately support people vulnerable to food insecurity through humanitarian assistance from the World Food Programme and other programs, alongside effective domestic fiscal measures. Second, maintain open trade, including within regions, to allow food to flow from surplus areas to those in need. Third, increase food production and improve distribution, increasing trade financing and reinforcing supply chains. Fourth, invest in climate-resilient agriculture. Excellencies, 18 months after the launch of Russia's full-scale aggression against Ukraine, there is no doubt that food again has become a weapon. Deliberately creating a food crisis, Russia shows disregard to the UN Security Council Resolution 2417, which condemns the starving of civilians as a method of warfare. We denounce Moscow's decision to withdraw from the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which played a stabilizing role for global food security. We consider this move as a manifestation of economic aggression against the countries of the Global South, political hypocrisy and cynicism. Recent escalation of Russian attacks on Ukrainian ports and mining sea corridors used for grain transport constitutes yet another proof of the Russian determination to prolong its war of aggression at any cost, including to the detriment of people who are most vulnerable to hunger and malnutrition. Madam President, Poland is ready not only to undertake emergency actions, but also to facilitate capacity building of more resilient production systems. In 2022, we supported the World Food Programme to ease the food security crisis in African countries. We have engaged in food solidarity initiatives. Besides the EU solidarity lanes and the Black Sea Grain Initiative, We supported the humanitarian program Grain from Ukraine and have declared to finance shipments of grain worth 20 million euro. In closing, let me emphasize that for Poland, protection of civilians and promoting compliance with international humanitarian law are long-standing priorities. We remain committed to contribute to actions aimed at protection of civilians in armed conflict and tackling global food security crisis. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Javel for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Oh, thank you, Madame President. First of all, I congratulate you on assuming the presidency of the Security Council for this month, and I wish you all success in this endeavor. I congratulate also our colleague from UK and her team for the excellent work done last month. Today's topic is crucial as we are facing a rise in acute food insecurity worldwide. Different UN reports outline that millions face starvation while necessary humanitarian assistance is lacking. As mentioned recently by the Secretary General, if current trend continue by 2030, nearly 670 million will suffer hunger. Moreover, the situation differs from one region to another. Africa is by far the most fragile region. Many of its inhabitants suffer from food insecurity, particularly in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa. A sad reality, especially that the African continent can become the bread basket of the world with more investment and technology transfer. The UN system, but also the financial institutions, should catalyze global efforts and address the root causes to reverse this situation, namely underdevelopment, climate change. Madam President, we concur with the concept note that the challenge of addressing food insecurity requires resilient food systems. Furthermore, to prevent the most severe form of hunger and ensure the food security of all, it is paramount to, first, adopt a holistic and integrated approach that involves all relevant stakeholders. Such an approach will build strong and resilient food systems. It is the cornerstone to ensure food security. Second, accelerate transfer of technology and capacity building of developing countries to produce their food. Achieving food security is a precondition of lasting peace and stability. Third, fulfill engagement under international agreement, in particular, those related to climate financing. This will allow vulnerable countries facing the adverse effect of climate change on their food system. Fourth, mobilize sustainable financing for agriculture in developing countries, in particular African countries. International financial institutions should adopt and implement solutions to support developing countries, including by concessional finance and grant. Fifth, fully respect international humanitarian law and implement Security Council resolution, in particular, Resolution 2417. It is key to facilitate access to humanitarian assistance in line with Resolution 46-182. It will reduce food insecurity and prevent famine in the context of humanitarian crisis. Algeria has spared no effort in providing assistance to its neighbor, in the Sahel especially, while they were facing conflict, consequences, and natural disaster. Madam President, achieving sustainable development, especially SDG 2, is the only way to break the link between conflict and food insecurity. Therefore, we urge the Security Council to work closely with the General Assembly and the ECOSOC to promote development solutions that leaves no one behind in access to safe food. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Algeria for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Egypt.
Mr. President, allow me at the outset to congratulate the United States of America for assuming the position of President of the Security Council for the month of August 2023. I would also like to express our appreciation to the initiative of the U.S. To hold today's high-level open debate. Egypt is fully cognizant of the severe impacts that hunger and failure to achieve food security pose on human livelihood, as well as contribute to increase the risk of conflict, especially in countries that suffer from economic vulnerability. Hence, we stress the strong and deep linkage between food security, hunger, and conflict. Mr. President, the world is currently witnessing an unprecedented food insecurity crisis that is a result of our failure to achieve a Sustainable Development Goal 2, to hunger. This was exacerbated by the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic as well as conflicts. Failure to achieve food security and end hunger will pose a threat to security and stability of countries and will further fuel ongoing conflicts. The challenges of achieving food security are further deepened by other factors, such as the ongoing impacts of climate that exacerbate risks related to energy production, food security, availability of water, and economic development. Water scarcity in several regions in the world, especially in Africa, have severe manifestations on the activities of agriculture and the efforts to achieve food security. In light of the above, we would like to highlight the following points. 1. The importance of addressing the challenges facing countries affected by and emerging from conflict. Special attention must be paid to food security, providing health care to the civilian population based on the principles of international humanitarian law and in accordance with national sovereignty. Also, it is important to ensure access of food aid to the civilian population in conflict areas and protecting them from the risk of famine, including in this regard the provision of food for people forcibly displaced. 2. Egypt reaffirms that sustainable solutions to current global conflicts necessitate the promotion of the peaceful settlement of disputes, ensuring that all efforts are taken into account the need to preserve the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, in addition to addressing the root causes of armed conflict, which includes promoting sustainable development. 3. I would like to highlight that Egypt is the most densely populated water-scarce country in the world. Currently, water scarcity affects 2.5 billion people around the globe, and it is expected that climate change will result in putting half of the world population under severe water stress by 2050. Moreover, water scarcity could displace 700 million people by 2030. These figures are a clear proof of the negative impact of water scarcity on peace and security, achieving sustainable development, and fulfilling human rights. In this context, we urge the international community to address the needs of the most vulnerable water-scarce countries and promote transboundary cooperation in accordance with the applicable international law. 4th, Food security and conflict must be addressed in a holistic and comprehensive approach that takes into consideration the humanitarian and developmental factors. Immediate action must be taken to alleviate hunger while also implementing plans to assist developing countries, especially net food importing developing countries, in achieving food security through sustainable agriculture. In this regard, I would like to recall the Egyptian initiative to utilize Egypt's geographic location to establish a logistics center for grains to address the challenges facing the global food supply chains, especially in developing countries. Mr. President, in conclusion, we would like to stress the urgency to address the challenges of food security and its linkage to conflicts in a comprehensive approach that aims at its core to achieve sustainable development of developing countries while ensuring their stability and prosperity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Egypt for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Liechtenstein.
Thank you, Mr. President. Liechtenstein welcomes this open debate on conflict and food security as hunger reaches new and concerning levels. Conflict is a primary driver of food insecurity in 7 of the 8 cases designated as hotspots with catastrophic conditions by the World Food Programme and the Food and Agriculture Organization. It has a devastating impact on every part of a food system, from planting to distribution. Often, it exacerbates already dangerous conditions for food insecurity. At the same time, food insecurity is itself a driver of further violence in regions like the Sahel, renewing the cycle of conflict and hunger. We therefore must take on a holistic approach that addresses the catastrophe of hunger both as a cause and consequence of conflict. Mr. President, if hunger as such is an affront to human dignity, the weaponizing of food is an outrage, and it is a criminal act. The intentional starvation of civilians is a war crime in international and non-international armed conflicts, as reflected in the Rome Statute of the ICC. We encourage all states to join us in ratifying the amendments to the Rome Statute presented by Switzerland that deal with the inclusion of starvation of civilians in internal armed conflict. In addition, Liechtenstein calls on conflict parties to adhere to their obligation under international law, as well as relevant Security Council resolution, notably 2417 and 2573. Mr. President, in Ethiopia, armed conflict along with the devastating drought has driven more than 20 million people into food insecurity, a crisis which has persisted even after last year's ceasefire agreement. The conflict in Sudan, where reportedly over 40% of the population is experiencing hunger, also threatens to have knock-on effects in Ethiopia and throughout the region. The humanitarian crisis in Yemen remains considerable, and we condemn the recent killing of the head of the World Food Programme office in Yemen, as well as of its workers in Sudan earlier this year. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine exemplifies the outside impact that conflict can have on food security, both domestically and abroad. Throughout the country, farms have been mined, water systems destroyed, and grain storage sites explicitly targeted in attacks. By withdrawing from the Black Sea Grain Initiative in mid-July, Russia once again acted in direct opposition to the security of millions of people worldwide. We also deplore the Russian veto blocking cross-border humanitarian aid to Syria last month. Mr. President, the challenges the world faces today, climate disaster, conflict, displacement, and food insecurity, are deeply interconnected. We encourage the international community, and particularly member states of the Council, to address these interlinkages through the perspective of human security, which acknowledges that peace and security is about people, their survival, livelihood, and dignity. We can begin by responding to the immediate needs of food insecure people around the world, including through increased funding for the World Food Programme and humanitarian organizations, and urging parties to armed conflict to protect food systems and infrastructure and refrain from turning access to food into a weapon of war. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Liechtenstein for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Germany.
Thank you. Mr. President, Resolution 2417 of this Council has been a real landmark decision. In 2018, all of its members have condemned starving of civilians as a means of warfare. 5 years later, a permanent member of the Security Council is using food as a weapon. Russia has unilaterally withdrawn from the Black Sea Grain Initiative and is destroying grain warehouses and port infrastructure in Ukraine with missiles. The Kremlin is doing so in order to recklessly fill its war chest. As a consequence, global food prices are rising and access to food is getting much harder for millions in need worldwide. Germany urges Russia to immediately stop these attacks, to stop blocking Ukrainian ports, and to rejoin the Black Sea Grain Initiative. We strongly support the UN's and Turkey's efforts to reinvigorate this initiative. Ultimately, Germany calls on Russia to immediately withdraw all its troops and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine in its international recognized borders. This will not only allow for grain exports to resume, but will return peace to Ukraine. Mr. President, Germany is strongly committed to combating global food insecurity and malnutrition. Food security and nutrition was high on our agenda as G7 presidency in 2022. Germany is the second largest donor to the WFP with a contribution of €1 billion in 2022. We support farmers and countries worldwide to produce their own food, and we will continue our efforts to export agricultural goods from Ukraine through the EU solidarity lanes and other alternative routes. Our joint efforts towards sustainable solutions need to be comprehensive and creative. Allow me to touch upon a few specific issues. First, climate change. The global community needs to drastically lower its emissions to fight the climate crisis and its negative repercussions on food security and malnutrition in many parts of the world. This is part of the nexus between climate change and peace and security, and we believe that the Security Council should discuss the issue systematically and on a regular basis. Second, we also believe that the Peace Building Commission can play a more systematic role in addressing these interconnected issues. It could, for example, give advice to the Security Council on country-specific situations where armed conflict and climate change exacerbate food insecurity. Lastly, we need to be creative and specific and find tailored solutions. One example, locally produced green nitrogen fertilizer has a lot of potential to support food security. It can increase resilience to price volatility and supply chain disruptions, while also contributing to reducing carbon emissions from the agricultural sector. We hope to develop this technology in innovative partnerships that enable more green growth. Mr. President, conflicts are among the main contributors to man-made global food insecurity, locally but also globally. Security Council Resolution 2417 is crystal clear in its obligations for all member states. We call upon all member states to respect them and start by stopping using food as a weapon of war. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Germany for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Thank you very much, President. Mexico thanks the United States for convening this open debate. We hope that it will allow us to identify specific actions that can strengthen the systems for food security around the world and prevent future famines. We are also grateful for the briefings that we have heard this morning. Joint and coordinated work by the agencies of the United Nations is essential for addressing and effectively mitigating the growing impacts of the food security crisis. For this reason, we feel that the decision by the Secretary General to appoint Madam Helani as the coordinator to prevent and address in a timely manner any risk of famine is a positive one. The early warning mechanisms are fundamental to avoiding humanitarian catastrophes. However, even more important is a timely and efficacious response. President, it is unacceptable that in a world of abundance, there is a constant increase in the number of people living in food insecurity. In May, we stated at this council that there were 193 million people in a situation of food insecurity. Now, there are already 258 million people affected by this. This is truly a tragedy. An increase of such magnitude in the space of just 1 year should be alarming to each and every one of us. While the causes of food insecurity are multidimensional, armed conflicts constitute a decisive factor in exacerbating these. Some specific cases represent particularly critical conditions such as Burkina Faso, Haiti, Mali, Sudan, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan. All of these cases demonstrate that when a conflict is prolonged, it almost inevitably leads to food insecurity. In our region, the gravest case is unfortunately Haiti. Half of its population, 4.9 million people, need food assistance. In Haiti, a series of diverse but interlinked causes have led to this deplorable situation. The economic recession, natural disasters, the harmful impacts of climate change, and a fall in agricultural production that has been exacerbated by the increase of armed violence and the lack of sustained investment. All of these have led the country to a situation of grave food emergency. President, it is imperative that we recognize that the food systems of the world as a whole are interdependent. An armed conflict can alter the food system as a whole. Mexico hopes that it will soon be possible to reactivate the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which had had a positive impact on food prices and thus reduced food insecurity in the poorest countries. By way of conclusion, Mexico once again calls on all parties to conflicts to fully abide by the provisions of Resolution 2417 of this Council and to abstain from any action that can affect the production and distribution of food or attacking objects that are indispensable for the survival of the civilian population. And let us not forget, of course, that famine or starvation as a tactic of war is an international crime and cannot go unpunished. I thank you.
Of Mexico for his statement. Colleagues, there are still a number of speakers remaining on my list for this meeting. I intend, with the concurrence of members of the Council, to suspend the meeting until 3 p.m. The meeting is suspended.